Medieval weapons. When bigger was definitely not better. To all those valiant knights who tripped over their own feet on the battlefield, may your clumsy falls inspire generations to come with laughter and renewed appreciation for the wonders of modern weaponry. This book is dedicated to you, the unintentionally comedic heroes of the medieval age, whose impractical weapons provided endless amusement for the ages. To the blacksmiths who tirelessly forged oversized swords that were, let's be honest, more suited to a very, very strong lumberjack than a knight in shining armor. Your dedication to the craft, however misplaced, is worthy of a hearty chuckle. To the engineers of siege weaponry, whose innovations often resulted in more harm to the besiegers than the besieged, your ingenuity, though occasionally chaotic, is truly worthy of praise, and perhaps a stronger safety net next time. Your spectacularly explosive mishaps certainly enlivened the siege, even if it wasn't always in the intended way. We salute your accidental artistry in the realm of unintentional pyrotechnics. To the designers of helmets, who with impressive creativity crafted headgear that was both decorative and alarmingly impractical, your efforts in the pursuit of style over substance deserve a nod and a knowing smile. Were those horns really necessary? We might never know, but we'll always wonder. To the strategists whose plans often ended in hilarious disarray, whose carefully crafted maneuvers frequently resulted in unexpected and often comical outcomes, your commitment to the art of war, if occasionally misguided, is a lesson in the unexpected twists and turns of history and the importance of always having a backup plan, preferably one that involves less accidental self-destruction. This book is dedicated to all of you, the wonderfully inept, hilariously hapless, and gloriously goofy warriors of the medieval period. Your legacy lives on, not in tales of unmatched prowess, but in the enduring amusement provided by your less than perfect weaponry and strategies. We thank you for the laughs and for inadvertently proving that sometimes the best weapon is a good sense of humor, and perhaps a well-maintained modern assault rifle. Just saying. Chapter 1. The bigger the better. Not always. The Zweihänder. The very name sounds impressive, doesn't it? Like something a particularly dramatic villain in a low-budget fantasy film might wield. And in all fairness, it was impressive. Impressively large, that is. Picture this. A blade so long it could practically double as a small, very pointy boat paddle. A weapon so heavy, its wielder likely needed a small cart to transport it to the battlefield, along with a team of sturdy oxen to pull said cart. This wasn't your run-of-the-mill longsword. Oh no, this was the Zweihänder, the two-hander, a great sword of such immense proportions that its effectiveness was, to put it mildly, debatable. Forget graceful, fluid movements. The Zweihänder was less a sword and more a lumbering, unwieldy beast of a weapon, requiring the strength of a small ox and the balance of not a particularly balanced person. Imagine a knight, clad in full plate armor, already weighed down like a medieval Michelin man, attempting to wield this behemoth. The sheer weight would have sapped his stamina in seconds, leaving him vulnerable to swifter, more agile opponents. Think of it less as a precise instrument of war and more as a very expensive, extremely heavy club with a sharp bit on the end. The Zweihänder's design seems almost perverse in its impracticality. Its sheer size rendered it almost useless in close quarters combat. The very environment where medieval battles often unfolded, trying to swing it with any kind of speed amongst a throng of enemies was like trying to swat a fly with a particularly oversized and very heavy frying pan. The chances of accidentally decapitating your own comrade were significantly higher than the chances of cleanly dispatching an enemy. In fact, a Zweihänder wielding knight was probably a greater danger to his allies than to his foes. And the maintenance. Can you imagine the sheer effort involved in keeping this monster of a blade honed and ready for battle? It wouldn't just be a case of a quick wipe down. We're talking hours of meticulous sharpening, oiling, and polishing. The unfortunate squire charged with this task would likely need a full team of assistants, a small crane, and several gallons of strong ale to get the job done. And then there's the sheer logistical nightmare of transporting it. A dedicated wagon just for the sword? Sure, along with a team to carefully lower it into position, and another team to carefully hold it up, while the knight slowly, painfully attached it to his harness. One can almost picture a hilariously inept knight, Sir Reginald the Clumsy, forever tripping over his own feet, bringing his mighty Zweihänder crashing to the ground with a resounding clang. His comrades would scatter, muttering about their chances of survival while simultaneously attempting to avoid becoming victims of Reginald's accidental battlefield ballet. He'd likely be more successful at knocking his fellow knights off their feet than he would at slicing through an enemy's armor. The battlefield strategy would become less about tactical maneuvers and more about a desperate attempt to keep out of Reginald's way. The irony, of course, is that this monstrous weapon was less a tool of warfare and more a status symbol. The Zweihänder's sheer size and weight served as a potent advertisement of its owner's wealth, power, and dare I say it, sheer lack of practicality. Owning one of these cumbersome swords was like owning a ridiculously oversized, impractical car. It screamed, "Look at me. I'm so rich I can afford a weapon so unwieldy, it's practically useless." It was less a statement about military prowess and more a blatant display of ostentatious wealth, a medieval equivalent of flexing your latest luxury purchase on social media. While battlefield accounts rarely mention Zweihänders being used effectively, mostly because there are practically no accounts of successful Zweihänder use. The sheer legend of this oversized blade has taken hold. Many have romanticized this cumbersome weapon, forgetting that wielding it required superhuman strength, ridiculous balance, and an almost unhealthy disregard for your own personal safety and the safety of those around you. It seems like the sword was designed less for efficient killing and more for impressing onlookers with its pure, unadulterated size. This massive weapon was likely not as effective as a regular longsword, but let's be honest, it was far more impressive to onlookers who may not know the first thing about battlefield effectiveness. The sheer weight of the Zweihänder would have hampered any nimble movements needed on a battlefield that likely resembled a chaotic mess of slashing, stabbing, and desperate shouts. To the trained eye, a knight struggling to maneuver such a weapon would be an obvious target. They may seem impressively powerful in the hands of a particularly enthusiastic artist, but the reality of wielding a Zweihänder on the battlefield would have been quite different. The weight problem alone must have led to issues of balance, while the sheer size alone may have led to the sword becoming dangerous in the hands of its wielder. An unbalanced swing would have also made it even more perilous for any allies nearby. With so many obstacles to face, it's safe to assume that the Zweihänder was less a battlefield weapon and more a testament to the medieval obsession with displays of wealth. One could almost imagine the knight, weighed down by the Zweihänder, slowly trudging across the battlefield, each step an agonizing effort, his every movement slow, deliberate, and predictable, an easy target, therefore, and certainly not an effective weapon. Let's consider the logistical nightmare for the knight and their comrades. How does one transport such a monstrous weapon? How does one maintain such an oversized, bulky blade? How does one even store such a thing? These practical issues, of course, are usually glossed over in the romanticized tales of medieval warfare, but the reality was far more unglamorous and, frankly, hilarious. And don't even get me started on the maintenance. Keeping that blade sharp and oiled would have been a Herculean task in itself, demanding more time and effort than many other weapons. While some sources claim that the Zweihänder was intended to be a two-handed weapon, the reality may be that many individuals found it difficult to even wield effectively. The sheer size and weight of the weapon may have led to a decrease in effectiveness on the battlefield. It seems likely that the Zweihänder was more of a show of wealth and strength rather than an effective weapon. So, the Zweihänder, a majestic, imposing, and ultimately impractical weapon, a testament to the occasional disconnect between the desire for impressive displays of power and the cold, hard realities of effective warfare. It serves as a humorous reminder that bigger isn't always better, especially when you're trying to win a battle. A knight armed with a Zweihänder was a spectacle, certainly, but likely not one that inspired much confidence in his fellow soldiers. He was probably the one they worried about, rather than the enemy. In essence, the Zweihänder remains a monument to medieval military over-engineering, a great sword of great inconvenience. Now, let's move on to a weapon that, while undeniably impressive in its own right, suffered from a similar lack of practicality as the Zweihänder, the bombard. Forget the sleek, efficient cannons of later eras. These were the clumsy, temperamental great-aunts of modern artillery. Imagine a colossal metal tube, often longer than a small car and nearly as wide, painstakingly constructed from iron bars bound together with hoops. This wasn't precisely engineered precision. It was more akin to a medieval Frankenstein's monster of a weapon. The process of loading a bombard was a spectacle in itself. First, a team of strong men would struggle to heave a stone ball, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds, into the yawning maw of the cannon. Then came the gunpowder, carefully measured, or perhaps not so carefully, depending on the competence of the crew. A spark, a plume of smoke, and a prayer. The prayer was often necessary. Unlike their later, more refined cousins, bombards possessed an unnerving tendency for spontaneity. Their accuracy was, to put it mildly, questionable. A direct hit was less a matter of skill and more a matter of sheer luck. More often than not, the cannonball would veer wildly off course, landing harmlessly in a field, taking out a friendly supply wagon, or, in one particularly infamous incident, I still haven't been able to verify the authenticity of the story, but it is deliciously absurd. landing squarely in the besiegers' own camp, causing more casualties amongst the attackers than the besieged. One could envision a medieval siege, less a carefully orchestrated military operation and more a chaotic comedy of errors. Imagine a scene: walls crenellated, defenders perched precariously, and below, a bewildering array of bombards unleashing their fury. A cannonball whizzes past, narrowly missing a terrified soldier, only to embed itself in the backside of a bewildered ox pulling a supply wagon. Another sails majestically into the air, describes a graceful arc, and lands harmlessly in a nearby farmer's field, causing considerable consternation amongst the chickens. Then, the pièce de résistance. A bombard backfires spectacularly, sending its crew sprawling through the air. A shower of sparks, smoke, and disgruntled medieval gunners. The unreliability of the bombards was legendary. Premature explosions were commonplace. The sheer force of these early cannons could easily result in the weapon itself shattering, showering the gunners with molten metal and fiery debris. Stories abound of soldier crews suffering more injuries from their own weapons than from enemy fire. Imagine the poor souls entrusted with the task of manning these unpredictable behemoths, praying for a successful shot while simultaneously bracing themselves for a potentially fatal malfunction. Their safety equipment would likely consist of little more than a prayer and maybe a leather helmet that could do little against a stray piece of the cannon itself. The logistical challenges were just as significant. The sheer size of these early cannons demanded not only a sizable crew for loading and aiming, but also significant resources for transportation and deployment. The logistics alone could often prove enough to delay or even prevent a siege. It would have taken several days or even weeks to transport a bombard into position, and the effort may only have led to the cannon bursting mid-launch. But the most delightful aspect of these medieval marvels was their utter unpredictability. It wasn't uncommon for a bombard to fire its projectile in a direction completely unrelated to the intended target. One might even surmise that the bombards possessed a peculiar sense of humor, choosing to make their own decisions on where to unleash their deadly, or rather, mostly harmless, stone projectiles. The trajectory of a bombard shot was as much a mystery to the gunners as it was to the besieged. One moment the cannon is pointed, the next, the shot goes careening off into some other direction, potentially even hitting those who intended to fire it. The strategic implications were interesting. A successful bombardment would certainly demoralize the defenders. Yet, it's hard not to imagine a siege where the besiegers find themselves under fire from their own weaponry more often than the enemy, leading to more friendly fire casualties than direct enemy hits. Such a scenario would leave the defenders in fits of laughter, watching from behind their walls as the attackers' own bombards rendered them harmless. Let's picture a scenario: a long and arduous siege, months of tension and attrition, only to be ultimately decided by the sheer number of friendly fire incidents resulting from a collection of bombards with more of a mind of their own than the crew who operated them. The sheer chaos could have been hilarious to the besieged who just kept hearing the sounds of exploding weapons and projectiles flying aimlessly near the launching site. One can almost hear the frustrated shouts of the commander, For the love of St. George, aim for the gate, not the cook's tent, only to have another projectile land harmlessly, or not so harmlessly, in a pile of supplies, causing a chain reaction of fire and chaos among the besiegers, as much as the besieged. The comical ineptitude of these early cannons is only further highlighted by the fact that they were often employed in situations where their size and limited accuracy were significant disadvantages. Imagine trying to use one in close quarters combat, attempting to lob a massive stone ball through a narrow gap in a fortress wall, only to have it bounce harmlessly off the side and land, somehow, on top of the king's personal tent. The bombard's limited range was another significant drawback. They were often less effective than simpler siege weapons, such as catapults and trebuchets, which could launch projectiles over longer distances with greater accuracy. The bombards may have been big, but they couldn't often deliver. The sheer manpower required to maintain and operate a bombard also meant they were not easily used. While impressive in size, they were rarely effective. To sum up, the bombard, while a significant step in the evolution of artillery, stands as a testament to medieval ingenuity and also medieval slapstick. It serves as a hilarious reminder that size doesn't always equate to effectiveness. It's a weapon that makes you appreciate the precision engineering of modern artillery while also making you wonder about the sheer chaos of a medieval siege, a chaotic spectacle filled with exploding cannons, wayward projectiles, and the sight of a commander trying desperately to keep his troops from getting killed by their own weapons rather than the enemy. It was a sight that would have made even the most stoic medieval knight crack a smile, if they survived to see it, of course. The bombards may have been impressive to see, but they did little to enhance the safety and efficiency of any military operations that utilized them. Their impracticality was so impressive that they are remembered more for their explosive nature rather than their capability. Now, if you thought the bombards were a comedy of errors, wait until you meet their less than lethal cousin, the morning star. This wasn't your delicate celestial morning star. Oh no, this was a brutal, spiked mace, usually featuring a heavy ball studded with wickedly sharp points, all attached to a long handle. Picture a medieval wrecking ball with attitude, and you're getting close. The morning star's size, while not quite reaching bombard proportions, still presented a significant challenge. These weren't dainty weapons, easily wielded by a scrawny page boy. These required a certain robustness. A knight clad in full plate armor, already weighed down by his formidable defenses, now had to swing this additional, sizable hunk of metal around. The resulting image is frankly somewhat ridiculous. Imagine a knight, looking like a walking suit of armor, valiantly attempting to brandish a weapon that is clearly not designed for the physical realities of medieval warfare. He may have looked fierce, but he would have struggled to make it through a battle, much less win one. The weight alone was enough to make the weapon less than effective. The sheer force needed to swing it with any kind of power would leave the user exhausted after a few swings. The effectiveness is greatly reduced if you have to stop and rest or breathe. There is no question that these weapons are more likely to wear out the user than the enemy, but the real comedic gold lies in the weapon's propensity for accidental self-harm. The morning star with its unwieldy length and unpredictable swing, was more likely to trip its wielder than to actually defeat an opponent. Envision a knight charging bravely into battle, his morning star held high, only to become entangled in his own feet, sending him sprawling to the ground in a heap of shining metal and flailing limbs. Suddenly, instead of being a fearsome warrior, he's a shiny armored target lying there, his face buried in the mud, and the battle cries of his comrades probably turned into laughter. One can almost picture the scene, the clash of swords, the thunder of hooves, and then, amidst the chaos, the resounding thud of a knight unceremoniously falling flat on his face thanks to his overly enthusiastic morning star. His comrades, momentarily stunned, would likely burst into laughter before resuming the fight. The opponent, perhaps briefly intimidated by the sight of this armored behemoth charging towards him, would have had a chance to recover and could now laugh at the poor knight. The Morning Star's design was simply not conducive to effective combat. Its large, heavy ball, while undeniably intimidating, had a tendency to gather momentum in a manner that wasn't necessarily aligned with the wielder's intentions. A slight miscalculation, a sudden stumble, or even a gust of wind could easily cause the weapon to swing wildly off course, potentially striking a friendly knight, an innocent bystander, or even knocking over a tent filled with precious and probably flammable supplies. Imagine a knight attempting a fearsome blow at his opponent, only to have his morning star swing wildly to the side, catching his own shield, or even worse, his own comrade. This would create an interesting dynamic. One of the knights would have to defend himself from the other knight, or try to stop the weapon from harming others. The scene would have had to have been hilarious to those watching. The unfortunate user of a morning star would have had to concern himself with not only striking the enemy, but also striking his own fellow soldiers. His weapon could be used against him, or at least be very inconvenient. Perhaps he would end up knocking his own fellow soldier into the enemy ranks, or perhaps even tripping himself into an ambush. The Morning Star was also surprisingly inefficient in confined spaces. Its long handle made it difficult to maneuver in close quarters, turning this potentially devastating weapon into a clumsy obstacle. Imagine a siege, knights attempting to assault a castle, a scene of chaos and confusion, and in the midst of it all, a knight flailing wildly with his morning star, catching himself in the corner and becoming a laughingstock to the enemy. It would be difficult to attack enemies in close quarters with this cumbersome weapon, while at the same time have to avoid your allies. The impracticality of the Morning Star extends beyond simple combat. Imagine the logistical nightmare of transporting these oversized weapons to the battlefield. The sheer weight of the Morning Star would require either strong horses or a significant number of human carriers, potentially slowing down the army's advance. Furthermore, the maintenance and repair of these weapons would have likely been quite a challenge. If a spike were to break off, or the ball became loose, this would require a skilled blacksmith, and that would lead to delays in repair or replacement. One can only imagine the medieval blacksmiths, tasked with repairing these consistently broken weapons, muttering to themselves about the inherent idiocy of the Morning Star's design. Perhaps they would have complained that no one understood the physics of a weapon and how it should function. The blacksmiths would have had to have been the ones fixing this impractical mess. To conclude, the morning star, while visually impressive, serves as another hilarious example of medieval weaponry where form utterly failed to follow function. It was less a weapon of war and more a comedic prop, a source of accidental injuries, and a constant source of amusement for those watching the chaos it unleashed. It was a weapon that would likely have caused more harm to the user and their allies than to the enemies. Its poor design and impracticality only served to showcase how the desire for something that looked impressive did little to enhance or help the combat capabilities of medieval soldiers. Its use is a testament to medieval ingenuity, but mostly to the medieval sense of humor. The morning star is certainly a testament to how looks can be deceiving and how impressive design does not always equate to effective fighting ability. Let's leave the clumsily wielded morning stars behind for a moment and delve into a more nuanced aspect of medieval weaponry, the social game. While the sheer impracticality of many medieval weapons is undeniably hilarious, it's equally fascinating to consider the social implications. These weren't just tools of war, they were status symbols, carefully chosen and ostentatiously displayed to project an image of wealth, power, and yes, even a certain degree of refined absurdity. Think about it. A knight, decked out in gleaming plate armor, wouldn't just carry any old sword. No, he'd likely wield a weapon that screamed, "I'm rich, I'm powerful, and I can afford a ridiculously oversized blade that's almost impossible to use effectively." This wasn't about practicality, it was about projecting an image. The bigger, the more ornate, the more impractical, the better. It was a visual testament to his social standing, a way of saying, "Look at me. I'm so wealthy and influential that I can afford to carry around a weapon that's more of a burden than an asset." The Zweihänder, that gargantuan greatsword, is a prime example. Its sheer size, sometimes exceeding 6 feet in length, made it a nightmare to wield in actual combat. Trying to use it effectively in the crush of a medieval battlefield would be like trying to wield a refrigerator in a crowded subway. Yet, the Zweihänder became a symbol of immense power and prestige. Owning one demonstrated not just military might, but also the financial resources to commission such a bespoke piece, to pay the blacksmith the exorbitant price of such a cumbersome weapon, and to maintain it. Consider the logistical implications. The Zweihänder wasn't exactly portable. It required dedicated transport, and its size likely made it difficult to maneuver in castles or across any terrain that wasn't entirely flat. The sheer weight of the weapon required significant strength and stamina just to hold it up. To swing it with any force would have taken Herculean effort, leaving the wielder exhausted after only a few swings. The impracticality didn't seem to matter. The Zweihänder's effectiveness in actual combat was questionable. Its true purpose lay in its social function. It served as a powerful visual representation of wealth and power, much like a modern-day supercar or a mansion, even if it couldn't travel at impressive speeds or even have enough room to invite many guests. This wasn't limited to swords. The same principle applied to other weapons. Ornate, elaborately decorated halberds, or incredibly heavy and intricately carved maces would have been chosen more for their visual impact and the message they conveyed than their military utility. These were not just weapons, they were walking billboards that announced their owner's wealth, status, and connections. These weapons were a conversation starter, a status symbol, and a way to announce your superiority and power. They served a clear social purpose, and they were often more effective at impressing than they ever were in battle. The same can be said for the lavishly decorated armor. While functional armor offered protection, the truly impressive suits were often laden with gold, silver, jewels, and intricate carvings. These weren't practical battlefield enhancements. They were walking works of art, demonstrating the owner's access to the finest materials and the most skilled artisans. The weight of such elaborate additions would have had to have been a burden, yet the benefits to social status far outweighed any practical drawbacks. Consider the impact of all this extravagant weaponry on the battlefield itself. Imagine a medieval army, a chaotic mix of swords, shields, and the occasional flying morning star. Now imagine a knight, adorned in gleaming, jewel-encrusted armor, carrying a Zweihänder almost as tall as himself. This knight wouldn't blend in. He would stand out, a symbol of his lord's power and prosperity. He would be less of a fighting machine and more of a moving piece of art, a visual representation of wealth and power. The irony, of course, is that the very things that made these weapons impressive also made them impractical. The weight, the size, the ornate decorations all served to hinder their effectiveness in actual combat. A knight burdened by such a weapon would likely tire more quickly than his opponent, making his position on the battlefield more fragile. The impracticality of these weapons meant that many were not often used. In fact, the weapons themselves were often more dangerous to their owners than to their enemies. But perhaps this is the key to understanding their purpose. These weren't weapons designed for efficient killing. They were weapons designed for social climbing. They were a way to demonstrate wealth, power, and social status, a statement of one's position within the rigid hierarchy of medieval society. They were, in a sense, a form of conspicuous consumption long before the term was even invented. The choice of weapon spoke volumes about its owner. A simple, functional sword suggested practicality and perhaps even a level of humility, while a massive, ornate Zweihänder spoke of extravagance and supreme social status. The choice of weapon was a statement of who you were in society and the position you were aiming for. It was a statement of both physical power and social dominance. This focus on social status helps us to understand the evolution of medieval weapons in a way that is more than just functional and practical. It wasn't simply about creating the most effective killing machine. It was also about creating a weapon that conveyed the desired image, a weapon that showcased the wealth and power of its owner. Therefore, the weapons were symbols of power, but not necessarily of martial ability. The practicality of the weapon was irrelevant. The purpose was the social benefit of owning a stunning and expensive weapon. Furthermore, consider the craftsmanship involved in creating these lavish weapons. These were not mass-produced items. They were works of art, crafted by skilled blacksmiths and artisans who put their hearts and souls into these stunning and often impractical weapons. The cost of such a weapon was extremely high. Even the materials needed to create such impressive weapons cost a great deal. This made owning such a weapon a statement of how wealthy you were. Only those of significant wealth could possibly afford to have them. The status symbol nature of these weapons also extended to the maintenance and repair of the weapons. Keeping these magnificent weapons in top condition demanded constant care and attention. The intricate carvings, the elaborate decoration, and the sheer size of these weapons all contributed to the time and money spent in keeping them up to standard. This was not merely a functional aspect of medieval life, but rather a further testament to the social standing and wealth of the owner. And it's not only the weapons themselves that were status symbols. The ability to use them effectively was also a marker of social standing. The skill involved in wielding a Zweihänder, for instance, was something to be admired and coveted. It showed not just physical prowess, but also the time and resources one had dedicated to training and mastery of the weapons. Therefore, the ability to master such difficult weapons was yet another demonstration of wealth and status. So the next time you see a depiction of a medieval knight, remember that his weapons are not just tools of war. They're also elaborate displays of wealth, power, and social status. They're a testament to the fact that in medieval times, as in our own, appearances can sometimes matter more than substance, and that a good-looking weapon, though impractical and cumbersome, may be a better way of making a statement than a battle-ready, but less flashy weapon. The weapons serve as a reminder that the pursuit of power and status, though sometimes amusing in its clumsiness, has always played a significant role in shaping our history and how we see military advancements throughout our past. But let's fast forward a few centuries, shall we? Let's leave the echoing clang of poorly wielded morning stars and the ponderous thud of a Zweihänder falling on its owner's foot behind us and step into the world of modern weaponry. The contrast is, to put it mildly, jarring. Where once we had lumbering, often impractical behemoths designed as much for show as for substance, we now have weapons of terrifying precision and efficiency. The evolution isn't just about bigger, it's about smarter, faster, and far, far more lethal. Imagine for a moment our knight, resplendent in his overly weighted armor, brandishing his unwieldy morning star. He charges into battle, his movements hampered by the weight of his equipment, his weapon a clumsy bludgeon more likely to injure himself than his foe. Now, contrast that image with a modern soldier, clad in lightweight, high-tech materials, armed with an assault rifle capable of unleashing a precise and devastating barrage of fire at a range our medieval knight could only dream of. The difference isn't merely incremental, it's a chasm spanning centuries of technological advancement. The shift from crude brutality to calculated precision is astonishing. Medieval weapons, for all their sometimes impressive artistry, were largely based on brute force. The goal was to inflict damage through sheer impact, with little concern for accuracy or range. A crossbow, while offering greater range than a sword, was still a relatively slow and cumbersome weapon, requiring significant time and effort to reload. A skilled archer could be deadly at a distance, but even then, there were limitations on the projectile's trajectory and power. Bombards, those early cannons, were essentially controlled explosions, more likely to inflict damage on the user's own troops than on the enemy, And with the explosive potential of such a device, you can imagine why this was of significant concern. Modern weaponry, on the other hand, is all about control and precision. Advanced materials, sophisticated engineering, and rigorous testing have resulted in weapons that are lightweight, easy to handle, and capable of inflicting devastating damage at remarkable distances. The assault rifle, for example, is a marvel of engineering, a highly refined instrument of death that combines accuracy, firepower, and portability in a way that would have been unimaginable to medieval weaponsmiths. Even the seemingly simple bullet has undergone a complex evolutionary process, evolving from crude projectiles to precisely engineered rounds capable of achieving pinpoint accuracy at extraordinary ranges. This evolution isn't just about the weapons themselves, but also about the tactics and strategies employed in warfare. Medieval battles were often chaotic, brutal affairs, characterized by hand-to-hand combat and a heavy reliance on sheer numbers. Modern warfare, however, involves sophisticated tactics, advanced surveillance technology, and coordinated strikes, often relying on precision-guided munitions that minimize civilian casualties, a concept completely alien to medieval warfare. While the medieval emphasis on the social status of the weapons created a clear divide in the battlefield between the wealthy and the poor, the weapons in and of themselves didn't exactly promote efficient battle practices. The improvements aren't merely incremental, they represent a fundamental shift in the philosophy of warfare. Medieval weapons, while serving a social function, often prioritized intimidation and display of wealth over outright efficiency. The sheer size and ostentatious decoration of many medieval weapons were arguably more about social signaling than battlefield effectiveness. This is not to say that medieval soldiers weren't skilled or brave, but their tools were fundamentally limited compared to modern counterparts. Consider the training involved. A modern soldier undergoes years of rigorous training, mastering complex weaponry and tactics. Their proficiency extends far beyond basic swordsmanship or archery. They are trained in marksmanship, explosives handling, tactical maneuvers, and much more. A medieval soldier, while undoubtedly possessing martial skills, wouldn't have had the same level of specialized training available. This difference in training has a direct correlation to the weapons used. The transition from the age of the Morning Star to the age of the assault rifle is more than just a technological leap. It's a reflection of the changing nature of warfare and society. The shift demonstrates not just an increase in technological sophistication, but also an evolution in our understanding of strategy, tactics, and the ethical implications of military conflict. It is in this transition that we truly appreciate the advancements of modern technology and the relative simplicity and occasional humor in the development of early weaponry. We've gone from weapons that were partly status symbols, partly tools of war, and partly potential self-inflicted injury devices to weapons designed for efficiency and precision. The difference is staggering, and the evolution speaks volumes about the progress humanity has made, though perhaps we should have put some more focus on the self-inflicted injury aspect of the older weaponry, since it seems modern weapons are very good at avoiding that specific kind of problem. But let's not get too carried away. Even modern weaponry has its share of quirks, malfunctions, unexpected outcomes, and the occasional logistical nightmare can still occur. Warfare, even with the most advanced technology, remains a complex and unpredictable business. Perhaps, as with our medieval counterparts, we've focused too much on the wow factor and forgotten some fundamental aspects of military operations. Perhaps, and I'm only speculating here, we need more emphasis on the self-inflicted injury prevention side of things. The transition from the crude, often comically impractical weapons of the Middle Ages to the sophisticated, precise instruments of modern warfare is a testament to human ingenuity, and a rather amusing reflection on our persistent desire to create weapons that are both effective and, at times, hilariously inefficient. The evolution of weaponry reflects not only technological advancements, but also the changing values and priorities of society. And of course, the occasional desire to have a weapon that makes a big statement, even if that statement is, I accidentally hit myself in the foot with my own weapon. The story of weapon evolution is a long and often funny journey. From the blunderbuss to the ballistic missile, from crude to cutting edge, we've come a long way. And the journey, as always, has been far more interesting and possibly more amusing than the destination. Chapter 2: Siege Warfare, More Comedy Than Conquest. Now, having bid farewell to the gloriously impractical handheld weaponry of our medieval ancestors, let's turn our attention to the truly spectacular failures of siege warfare. Forget the clumsy morning star. We're talking about machines of war so grand, so ambitious, and so often hilariously inept, they deserve their own comedic opera. We're talking, of course, about siege engines. The medieval siege engine was a marvel of, sometimes, engineering, a testament to human ingenuity, and a frequent source of slapstick comedy. Imagine, if you will, a towering structure of wood and rope groaning under the weight of massive stones, or, in more ambitious designs, a terrifyingly large projectile meant to breach the mightiest of walls. These weren't simply weapons. They were elaborate, complex machines requiring teams of skilled, or at least enthusiastic, engineers, carpenters, and laborers to construct and operate. One of the most common types of siege engines was the trebuchet. Now, the trebuchet, in theory, was a thing of beauty. A giant sling, powered by a counterweight, it could hurl massive stones over considerable distances, raining destruction upon hapless defenders. In practice, however, things were rarely so smooth. The counterweights, often consisting of tons of earth, stones, or whatever else the besiegers could get their hands on, had a tendency to shift unexpectedly. Imagine the scene: a team of sweaty, exhausted men straining to pull a massive lever to launch the projectile, only to have the counterweight topple over, sending tons of earth cascading into the midst of their fellow besiegers, creating an unintended but wholly entertaining sandcastle of chaos. Then there were the mangonels, a type of siege engine that resembled a giant crossbow. These machines, with their powerful springs or twisted ropes, were designed to launch smaller but more numerous projectiles, often bolts or stones. However, the immense power of these machines often worked against them. Overstressed ropes would snap with dramatic flare, sending the missile hurtling wildly off course, possibly into friendly territory, or more entertainingly, into the engine itself. One can practically imagine the mangonel operator, amidst a chaotic hail of splinters and stones, yelling in frustration at the heavens, or perhaps just the next nearest team of engineers. And let's not forget the onagers, a type of torsion siege engine that used twisted ropes to power its projectile. Their names, onager meaning wild ass, hint at the unpredictable nature of these machines, with their ability to launch their projectiles with surprising speed and inaccuracy. If a trebuchet's trajectory was somewhat unpredictable, an onager was an exercise in pure chance, with projectiles frequently veering wildly off target. Picture this: a carefully planned siege, a precise targeting system, and then the projectile goes sailing harmlessly over the besieged town, landing innocuously several leagues away, possibly ending up as a conversation piece on some farmer's field. The construction of these engines was an undertaking in itself, a feat of engineering, requiring a substantial workforce and a vast amount of raw materials. The wooden structures, often massive in scale, were vulnerable to weather conditions. Imagine a violent rainstorm during a siege, the wooden beams of a trebuchet swelling with rain, the ropes becoming waterlogged and unwieldy, threatening to collapse the entire contraption, possibly under the weight of its own components. The scene is almost Shakespearean in its potential for calamity, but even if the siege engine managed to survive the construction phase and withstand the elements, there was always the risk of mechanical failure. Gears would grind and strip, axles would snap, and ropes would fray under the immense strain. The sheer size and complexity of these machines created a plethora of potential points of failure, each one capable of transforming a carefully planned siege into a comedy of errors. One can picture the scene. The siege is progressing wonderfully. The massive stone catapults are launching huge projectiles with satisfying thwunks, until suddenly one of the largest of these contraptions goes spectacularly wrong, with massive timbers collapsing, gears exploding, and a shower of metal and stone sending a cloud of panic and confusion over the entire operation. Moreover, the targeting systems of these machines were, to put it mildly, rudimentary. There wasn't much in the way of sophisticated rangefinders or aiming mechanisms. The art of aiming a siege engine was more guesswork than science, often relying on the experience of the operator and a generous dose of luck. Picture this: a skilled operator, his brow furrowed in intense concentration, making tiny adjustments to the counterweight, peering through the smoke, and yelling instructions to his crew as they attempt to correct the angle of this ridiculously large thing, only to have the projectile fall several feet short of its intended target, landing harmlessly in a flower garden. Then there's the matter of the projectiles themselves. The stones used in these siege engines were often enormous, weighing several hundred pounds. These were not small pebbles, but rather large, cumbersome rocks that needed to be laboriously hauled into position. Imagine the scenes at each launch, the grunting and straining of the besiegers as they heave the gargantuan stones into the waiting machine's cradle, their combined strength only just enough to complete this incredible feat of, in hindsight, mostly unnecessary human engineering. The use of siege engines wasn't merely a matter of launching projectiles, it was a logistical nightmare. The engines themselves were massive and difficult to transport, requiring considerable time and effort to assemble on site. And once assembled, they were often slow and cumbersome to operate. A single launch could take minutes, if not longer, leaving the engine vulnerable to counterattack. The sheer amount of time, effort, and raw materials required for a siege campaign must have been staggering, not to mention the sheer amount of potential for hilarious disaster. One can't help but wonder how many of the siege engines were destroyed by accidental self-inflicted damage. Were the casualties of their use due to enemies or their own structural flaws? History, unfortunately, hasn't kept such detailed records. Furthermore, the psychological impact of these clumsy giants was often less terrifying than comical. Imagine the defenders on the walls, watching as the enormous siege engine creaks and groans, threatening to collapse under its own weight or misfire wildly, sending projectiles bouncing harmlessly off their defenses. Rather than inspiring fear, these magnificent failures likely provoked laughter, or at least a bemused sigh of relief. The story of siege engines is a story of human ambition, ingenuity, and a healthy dose of slapstick. They were impressive machines, no doubt, but their frequent failures serve as a reminder that even the most grand plans can go spectacularly wrong. And in the annals of medieval warfare, the comedy of errors surrounding these magnificent machines serves as a reminder that the most powerful weapons are not always the most effective. Sometimes, the best weapon is a good laugh, especially if it's at the expense of your enemy's extremely expensive and laboriously created siege engines. The history of siege engines is a hilarious demonstration of the complexities of medieval technology, a humorous reminder that ambition, even in warfare, can often lead to comical results. It was often more likely to break than breach. Now, let's shift our focus from the groaning timbers and errant projectiles of siege engines to the minds of those who built, operated, and endured them. Siege warfare wasn't just about engineering marvels gone awry. It was a psychological chess match played out against a backdrop of fear, boredom, and occasionally utter absurdity. The besiegers, for all their impressive weaponry, faced their own unique brand of terror. Months could be spent camped outside city walls, exposed to the elements, relying on precarious supply lines, and constantly anticipating a sally, a sudden and unexpected attack from the defenders. Think of the sheer monotony, punctuated only by the occasional, and often wildly inaccurate, launch of a siege engine projectile. The fear wasn't just of the enemy, but of disease, starvation, and the ever-present risk of a catastrophic failure of one's own elaborate and expensive war machines. Imagine the tension, the sheer weight of expectation resting on the shoulders of the engineers responsible for the giant trebuchet as they carefully adjusted the counterweight. One wrong move could mean not just a missed shot, but the collapse of the entire structure and a heap of embarrassment. And let's not forget the poor souls assigned to fetch the stones. The sheer quantity of those behemoths and the likely hilarious and very inconvenient slips and falls during hauling must have been a source of constant anxiety. The job probably wasn't high up on the medieval career ladders. Then there's the matter of morale. Long sieges, particularly those marked by a string of comical mishaps involving badly aimed projectiles or malfunctioning siege engines, could severely test the resolve of even the most seasoned soldiers. Imagine the commander trying to maintain order and enthusiasm among his troops while dealing with the fallout of yet another failed siege engine launch and the resultant cascade of stones, timbers, and a very angry engineer. The besieged, on the other hand, faced a different set of psychological challenges. Confined within their walls, they were subjected to a constant barrage of psychological warfare. The relentless pounding of siege engines, the sight of the besiegers' camp sprawling below, the ever-present threat of a breach, all this contributed to a state of constant anxiety. Imagine the scenes within the city walls, the fear etched on the faces of the inhabitants as another giant stone slams into the wall nearby. The anxious whispers, the hushed prayers, the ever-increasing tension as the supply of food dwindles. The stories spread about the besiegers' absurd attempts at breaching the walls, the jokes and attempts at humor to lighten the mood. The tension must have been so thick you could cut it with a particularly blunt battle axe. But even amidst the fear, there was room for farce. Imagine a situation where a miscommunication leads to a crucial element of the siege being completely overlooked. Perhaps the engineers misinterpreted the commander's orders, leading them to construct a siege tower far too short to reach the city walls. The sight of this comically inadequate structure would no doubt have been a source of amusement for both besiegers and besieged alike. Or perhaps a messenger carrying a vital piece of information gets hopelessly lost in the chaos and confusion. Or imagine a situation involving a siege that involves a particularly disastrous incident, perhaps due to a careless error, some sort of natural disaster, or the unexpectedly high number of poorly thrown rocks from the trebuchet. Consider the effects of boredom. Sieges were often drawn-out affairs, stretching over months or even years. During these long periods of inactivity, the lives of both besiegers and besieged were dominated by routine and anticipation. For the besiegers, this meant endless drills, repair work on siege weaponry, and the ever-present anxiety of an attack or a sudden, unexpected shift in the siege's momentum. For those inside the city walls, the tedium was likely even more pronounced, with the daily grind of trying to maintain morale while dealing with the lack of food and dwindling hope. The psychological aspect of siege warfare extended beyond simple fear and boredom. There was the constant pressure of managing morale, the risk of mutiny amongst the troops if the siege went on too long, the ever-present possibility of disease, famine, or a sudden violent act of nature. Siege warfare was not only a battle for territory, but also a battle for minds, a game of psychological attrition. The siege was often an exercise in seeing who could endure the monotony the best, with a good helping of fear and occasional bursts of chaos. There were also moments of dark humor amidst the tension. The absurdity of it all, the sheer scale of the siege weapons, the comical failures, the unpredictable nature of battle, offered a much-needed outlet for stress and tension. Black humor, a coping mechanism of the medieval era, was employed to lighten the mood, and in a grim sense, to offer a form of psychological resilience against the horrific conditions of a siege. Many tales and anecdotes from this period have been passed down, often embellished with satirical details, to offer a reflection of the experiences of both besiegers and besieged. The jokes probably weren't as clean as today's, considering the medieval sense of humor often leaned towards the scatological. The story of siege warfare is not merely a tale of engineering prowess and military strategy. It's also a fascinating study of human psychology under pressure, the fears, anxieties, and even the occasional bouts of absurd laughter that colored the experiences of both besiegers and besieged offer a compelling glimpse into the human condition during a period of significant military and societal change. It was a time when the grand ambitions of warfare often met with a humbling dose of slapstick, and the best defense against terror was sometimes a collective, nervous chuckle. Perhaps the most successful siege tactics involved the strategically planned and perfectly timed collapse of an overly ambitious siege engine. The best way to defeat the enemy was to simply make them laugh until their sides hurt, and make sure they were laughing so hard that they couldn't remember the siege plans or where they hid their ammunition. After all, a good laugh can be a mighty weapon indeed, particularly when faced with the absurdities of medieval siege warfare. It certainly kept things interesting. Now, let's delve into the messy, hilarious reality of some famous and infamous sieges. Forget the romanticized images of valiant knights and perfectly executed maneuvers. These stories are far more entertaining when viewed through the lens of slapstick comedy and unexpected twists. Take, for instance, the Siege of Malta in 1565. While the valiant defense against the Ottoman Empire is rightly celebrated, the reality was a bit more chaotic. Imagine the sheer logistical nightmare, coordinating the defense of a tiny island against a vastly superior force, relying on hastily constructed fortifications and a motley crew of knights and local militia. The Ottomans, for their part, were apparently not fans of Maltese hospitality. Their siege engines, monstrous creations meant to tear down the island's defenses, were, to put it mildly, inconsistent. Some shots sailed over the walls and landed harmlessly in the sea. Others inexplicably hit their own lines. Picture the scene: thousands of Ottoman soldiers being bombarded with their own errant projectiles, while Maltese defenders watched with a mix of terror and amusement. The whole thing must have looked like a particularly messy game of medieval bowling, with the Maltese as the lucky pin setters. The siege, famously chronicled as a clash of titans, was also a bizarre blend of military strategy and sheer happenstance. A crucial element, the timing of a supply convoy's arrival, hung precariously in the balance. Imagine the tension: the knights, desperately low on supplies, watching the horizon for their lifeline. Did the convoy arrive? Yes, but only just before the defenders completely ran out of cheese, and that's what historians conveniently left out. A near miss that could have been the stuff of legends. The heroic defense ending not in glorious victory, but in a mass surrender caused by cheese-induced delirium. Then there's the Siege of Alesia in 52 BC, a stunning feat of Roman military engineering that almost went spectacularly wrong. Caesar's genius in surrounding Vercingetorix's Gallic army is undeniable, but the logistics were mind-boggling. Imagine the sheer scale of the operation: two concentric rings of fortifications encompassing both the besieged Gauls and the besieging Romans, a complex network of supply lines, and the constant threat of attack from both inside and outside the lines. One slight miscalculation, a single breach in the defenses, and the whole thing could have crumbled into chaos. And let's not forget the weather. Imagine the Roman engineers desperately trying to keep their elaborate fortifications from being washed away by a sudden downpour, as Gallic warriors looked on with a mixture of fear and amusement. The sheer scale of this logistical operation, the intricate planning, and the potential for catastrophic failure make it a truly dramatic and potentially hilarious tale. The Siege of Constantinople in 1453, the event that marked the end of the Byzantine Empire, provides another fascinating and comedic case study. The Ottomans' massive cannons, impressive feats of engineering, were responsible for some serious damage, but they were also notoriously slow to reload, providing defenders with brief respites or cannon loading breaks, during which they could repair breaches or simply catch their breath. Think of the Ottoman gunners, sweating under the pressure of firing these behemoths, occasionally causing more trouble than actual damage. Stories abound of accidental explosions, missed shots, and near misses. The siege was a brutal affair, but amidst the carnage, there were surely moments of almost farcical mishaps that broke the tension. Moving away from the larger sieges, consider the myriad smaller conflicts, where the comedy often lies in the sheer incompetence. Imagine a siege involving a castle, besieged by a group who are clearly not siege experts. They might be equipped with siege engines that are too small, too weak, or simply designed incorrectly. Imagine their siege towers, wobbly and rickety, collapsing before they even reach the walls. Picture the sight of besiegers attempting to breach the castle using laughably inadequate means, like a poorly constructed battering ram made from hastily assembled branches and ropes, their poorly constructed ladders collapsing under the weight of the elite soldiers. The whole siege could descend into a series of comical failures, making it more of a slapstick comedy than a serious military operation. The smaller sieges, often unrecorded or only mentioned in fleeting accounts, were opportunities for local squabbles and misadventures, providing ample opportunities for farce. A badly timed rain shower turning a carefully constructed siege mound into a muddy mess. A sudden argument between rival commanders leading to a chaotic retreat. A messenger delivering a crucial missive ending up in the wrong camp, setting off a series of hilarious misunderstandings. These smaller sieges, often overlooked in grand historical narratives, offer a unique window into the absurdities of medieval warfare. They provide a window into local conflicts and the unpredictable nature of human interactions when confronted with the stressful situation of war. Indeed, the psychological impact of a prolonged siege is something historians only begin to truly understand now. The constant pressure, the limited supplies, the psychological warfare of the besiegers, it would all be enough to drive many to the brink of insanity. But in those dark moments, there was often humor, a way to maintain morale and stave off despair. Imagine the stories shared within the city walls, the exaggerated tales of the besiegers' incompetence, the cynical jokes about the siege engines, the absurd rumors. The jokes, perhaps a bit too crude for modern audiences, may well have been a crucial ingredient to survival. And what of the besiegers? Imagine the boredom, the monotony of weeks, even months of waiting, of repairing siege engines, of enduring the taunts and jeers from the defenders. The humor here might have been darker, a sardonic acceptance of the absurdity of the situation. There were surely countless stories, darkly comic tales passed around the campfires, designed to ease the tedium and the fear. The siege mentality itself is, upon closer inspection, quite intriguing. The strategies, the weaponry, the organization, all were affected by the mindset of the combatants. Consider the effects of paranoia and rumor, the way a small incident could escalate into a larger crisis due to miscommunication, fear, or poor leadership. Consider how easily a siege could devolve into chaos through a sudden shift in momentum, an unexpected attack, or a change in the weather, a scenario that would likely have elicited much humor amongst the observers. The history of siege warfare is not just a succession of battles won and lost, it's a tapestry woven with threads of triumph, disaster, and downright absurdity. It's a story of human ingenuity and human folly, of grand military strategies undone by simple mishaps. Ultimately, understanding these sieges requires an appreciation not only for the military aspects, but also for the deeply human elements, the humor, the fear, the resilience, and the surprisingly important role of laughter in the face of adversity. It is a story ripe for the telling, and it is a story that perhaps unexpectedly is quite hilarious. So next time you hear about a great siege, remember the stones, the slings, and the sheer glorious chaos that often defined it. And remember to appreciate the humor and the resilience that got these people through their respective battles, and keep in mind that many of the successes or failures of the battles were dependent on circumstances completely beyond the control of the combatants. Who knew medieval warfare could be so funny? Let's move on to the weaponry itself, the glorious, often ludicrous, arsenal employed in these medieval sieges. Forget sleek, efficient modern ordnance. We're talking about contraptions that were more likely to injure the user than the enemy, devices that defied logic, and designs that were less military engineering and more inspired guesswork. First up, the battering ram, the workhorse of the siege, or at least it should have been. The classic image, of course, is a massive log reinforced with iron, swung by a team of heavily muscled men, crashing against castle gates with earth-shattering force. Reality, however, was somewhat less dramatic. For starters, building a decent battering ram was a logistical nightmare. Finding a suitably large and sturdy log wasn't easy, and transporting it to the siege lines could be even more challenging. Then, there's the problem of synchronization. Imagine coordinating dozens of men, all trying to swing this behemoth in unison. A single missed beat, a slight stumble, and you've got a chaotic mess of flailing limbs and splintering wood, far more likely to injure your own troops than breach the enemy's defenses. And let's not even get started on the potential for the ram to get stuck, or for the gate to be unexpectedly sturdy, leaving your ram looking rather foolish and your siege army thoroughly unimpressed. It wasn't uncommon, apparently, for the ram to just break under its own weight, or under the weight of enthusiastic but poorly coordinated soldiers. Then there are the siege towers, those towering wooden structures designed to bring attackers directly to the enemy walls. In theory, a fantastic idea. In practice, a bit more precarious. Building a stable, tall siege tower was a Herculean task, requiring a significant amount of timber, skilled carpentry, and, crucially, a level of engineering skill that was often lacking in medieval armies. Imagine a 50-foot tall, rickety wooden monstrosity, slowly creaking its way toward the walls, easily vulnerable to fire and prone to collapsing under its own weight, with the brave attackers tumbling down in a messy heap. We should probably include the fact that the defenders had a great deal of fun setting these siege towers on fire, or even just pushing them over with ropes and pulleys. And let's not forget the mangonel, a fearsome-looking trebuchet that launched large stones at enemy fortifications. This isn't a simple slingshot, you understand. This is a marvel, sometimes, of medieval engineering, involving a complex system of levers, ropes, and counterweights. The sheer size of these things was impressive, though the accuracy less so. Many mangonels were little more than glorified rock-launching devices, prone to erratic throws. Imagine the scene: a giant stone hurtling through the air, intended for the castle walls, but landing instead in a nearby field of sheep, or maybe even in the besiegers' own camp. Some mangonels had a reputation for being unusually temperamental, launching projectiles at unpredictable angles, leading to a kind of medieval artillery roulette. Moving on to the truly bizarre, we have the bombards. These early cannons, precursors to the mighty artillery pieces of later centuries, were truly something to behold. Massive, unwieldy, and prone to explosions, they were the medieval equivalent of a temperamental teenager with a lot of explosive potential and an unfortunate tendency to blow themselves up. Loading them was a hazardous process, requiring a lot of muscle power and a healthy dose of bravery, or perhaps a stunning lack of self-preservation. The cannons were also incredibly inaccurate, making them less a precise weapon and more of a hope and pray system. They could take a lot of time to reload, which was often the time frame where the enemy would be able to repair the damage that was just done. Of course, there were other ingenious contraptions, or perhaps ingenious is too kind a word. There were devices that were frankly just comical. We had the Greek fire, a terrifying concoction that burned fiercely on water, great in theory, but notoriously difficult to control, and often more likely to burn down the user's camp than the enemy's fortifications. There were also bizarre mining techniques, involving digging tunnels beneath enemy walls. This, I imagine, was not much fun, being underground with the possibility of a collapse, and then all of the time and effort being wasted when the tunnel collapses and the miners are killed. Let's not forget the psychological warfare. The sheer size and apparent destructive power of some of these weapons were probably just as important as their actual effectiveness. The sight of a massive siege tower lumbering towards the walls, or a bombard unleashing its fiery breath, would have been terrifying, even if the actual damage inflicted was minimal. The goal was often not necessarily to breach the walls immediately, but to demoralize the defenders and make them more likely to surrender. Medieval psychological warfare was a brutal business, and in the absence of social media, relied heavily on the visual impact of large, scary-looking machines that sometimes didn't work properly. In conclusion, the medieval siege weaponry arsenal was a curious blend of impressive engineering and utter ridiculousness. These were weapons that were as likely to cause friendly fire incidents as they were to breach enemy walls, devices that were more impressive for their sheer size and audacity than their practical effectiveness. They remind us that even in the midst of brutal warfare, there's always room for a bit of unintentional humor, and that even the most powerful weapons can be hilariously inept when faced with the simple laws of physics, the whims of the weather, or the sheer force of bad luck. The sheer lack of quality control in the making of these weapons was almost as impressive as the weaponry itself. So, next time you see a picture of a medieval siege, remember the comical chaos of it all and the impressive resilience of the individuals who used these devices in the first place. Now, let's shift our focus from the individual weapons of siege warfare to the grand strategies themselves, the elaborate plans, the cunning maneuvers, the spectacularly boneheaded blunders. Medieval siege tactics were a fascinating blend of military science, as it was understood then, and sheer, unadulterated improvisation. Think of it as a game of incredibly messy, occasionally deadly, chess played with catapults and surprisingly flammable siege towers. One of the most common and arguably most sensible tactics was the good old-fashioned encirclement. This involved surrounding the target fortification, cutting off its supply lines, and slowly starving the defenders into submission. Sounds simple, right? In theory, yes. In practice, it was often hampered by logistical nightmares. Imagine coordinating the movement and supply of thousands of soldiers, countless horses, and enough food and water to keep them all alive for potentially months. This was pre-refrigeration, people. We're talking about the delicate art of keeping vast quantities of perishable goods from rotting before they could even reach the siege lines. A sudden rainstorm could turn a well-planned siege into a massive mud wrestling competition, with the added disadvantage of spoiling all the provisions. Then there was the delicate dance of siege psychology. The medieval equivalent of memes and trolling involved some truly creative methods. For example, a common tactic was to send in a seemingly endless stream of insults and taunts toward the besieged garrison. These would often be delivered by loudspeakers, or whatever medieval equivalent those would be, that would be carried by the siege weapons themselves, like loudspeakers made of metal sheets that would yell insults at the enemy walls. The goal? To demoralize the defenders and make them more susceptible to surrendering. This wasn't always successful, however. Some defenders responded with their own creative retorts, leading to a fascinating war of words, sometimes even escalating into a full-blown exchange of insults and challenges, all while the siege continued. Imagine the scene: a heavily armed knight yelling insults from a siege tower, while an equally annoyed defender tossed dung from the ramparts. Sometimes, the insults involved throwing actual things at the enemy camp, like small rocks, dung, or rotten food. This was actually quite effective in demoralizing and agitating the opposing side. For the siege, it was important to take into consideration the terrain and the weather. The terrain could affect the direction and trajectory of the siege weapons, and this should be something that the siege engineer should have considered when conducting their analysis before beginning the siege. The weather, too, could be a major obstacle. A strong wind could blow siege weapons around, or cause the supply lines to be cut, while rain could turn the ground into a muddy mess. Of course, not all medieval siege tactics were so subtle. Sometimes, the simplest approach was the most brutal, just smashing through the gates with an oversized battering ram. This straightforward approach was surprisingly effective, at least when the ram wasn't spontaneously combusting, snapping in half, or getting stuck halfway through the gate. As we established earlier, the construction and operation of a battering ram was a testament to the ingenuity and the sheer amount of manpower and effort required to move a battering ram and destroy the castle gate. But then again, sometimes it just didn't work. Mining was another popular, though often unsuccessful, tactic. Digging tunnels beneath enemy fortifications to undermine the foundations and create a collapse was a grueling, dangerous business, often involving a lot of sweat, dirt, and a high probability of being crushed to death. If the miners were successful, the result was often a spectacular and thoroughly messy collapse of enemy walls. However, if the tunnels collapsed before they reached their target, it would result in a loss of men and wasted time and effort. The defenders would then usually plug the hole up, making future attacks impossible. Then there were the truly bizarre tactics, the ones that would make any modern military strategist scratch their head. Think of ingenious, and often incredibly dangerous, methods of scaling the walls, like using ladders, siege towers, which, as we know, were prone to catastrophic failure, or even attempting to climb over the walls using ropes or grappling hooks. This was usually unsuccessful and was often resulted in many casualties, or sometimes even the failure of the whole siege. The defenders usually had some kind of weapon that would be used to defend against this. Let's not forget the use of fire. Setting enemy fortifications ablaze was a classic and often effective tactic. However, controlling the fire was another matter entirely. Medieval siege warfare often involved a chaotic dance of flaming projectiles, wildly inaccurate incendiary devices, and a high chance of accidentally setting one's own camp alight. This usually resulted in a loss of provisions, soldiers, and siege weapons. It could sometimes cause the whole siege to fail. The strategic use of deception was also common. Fake attacks, cleverly disguised movements, and elaborate ruses were all tools in the medieval siege commander's arsenal. The goal was to confuse and disorient the defenders, creating opportunities to exploit their weaknesses. These tactics often involved a considerable amount of acting, costuming, and a willingness to endure potentially embarrassing failures. Imagine a small group of soldiers dressed as peasants attempting to sneak into the castle under the guise of delivering supplies, only to be discovered and chased away by angry defenders, or perhaps a fake attack on one section of the wall to distract the defenders while a real attack was launched elsewhere. The outcomes of medieval sieges were often unpredictable and depended on a variety of factors, including the skill of the commanders, the strength of the fortifications, the morale of the defenders, and yes, even a bit of dumb luck. Sometimes, a seemingly insurmountable fortress would fall surprisingly quickly, while other times, a seemingly weak fortification would withstand a prolonged siege with astonishing tenacity. This would often depend on the effectiveness of the siege engines, the morale of both the attacking and defending forces, the weather, and the availability of supplies. In conclusion, medieval siege warfare was a messy, chaotic, and often hilarious affair. It was a testament to human ingenuity, resilience, and the enduring power of incredibly impractical tactics. The strategies, while sometimes brilliant, were often marred by comical miscalculations, logistical nightmares, and a healthy dose of unintended consequences. It was a world where the best laid plans could go awry at the slightest provocation, where a sudden rainstorm could ruin a weeks long siege, and where a poorly aimed catapult stone could end up causing more damage to the besiegers than to the besieged. In short, it was a period of history that, when viewed through a humorous lens, offers a delightful blend of military strategy, engineering disasters, and sheer absurdity. And that's a story that deserves to be told, albeit with a healthy dose of laughter. Chapter 3: Armor, More Style Than Substance. Chainmail. The very word conjures images of valiant knights, shimmering in the sun, their every move a testament to their martial prowess. A romantic vision, to be sure. The reality, however, was rather less glamorous. Imagine, if you will, a suit of armor made entirely of tiny, interlocking metal rings, thousands of them, each one meticulously crafted, painstakingly connected, and collectively weighing enough to make a small pony contemplate a career change. This wasn't your lightweight, breathable athletic gear. This was the medieval equivalent of wearing a full set of bicycle chains, a somewhat rigid, decidedly inflexible, and utterly sweltering suit of armor. The weight alone was enough to make even the most robust knight consider a career in sedentary pursuits, like perhaps professional napping. Picture a knight, resplendent in his chainmail, attempting a swift maneuver on the battlefield. He'd move more like a lumbering, heavily armored turtle than a nimble warrior, his movements hampered by the sheer mass of metal clinging to his person. Forget graceful swordplay. This was more akin to a very slow, very metallic shuffle. And the heat, oh, the glorious, unbearable heat. Medieval summers were notoriously warm, and wearing chainmail was like being encased in a metal sauna. Imagine sweating profusely beneath layers of metal, the sun beating down, the screams of battle ringing in your ears, and the constant chafing reminding you of your unfortunate fashion choice. A knight's armor wouldn't have been terribly effective for stealth missions. The sound of all that chainmail clanking could be heard for miles. That would also be an easy way to identify the wearer. The romantic notion of knights effortlessly gliding across the battlefield, their chainmail shimmering like liquid moonlight, is largely a fabrication. The reality was far more prosaic. Knights were often hot, sweaty, and thoroughly uncomfortable. Their movements were restricted, their visibility reduced, and their overall effectiveness hampered by this impractical, albeit historically significant, form of body armor. One can only imagine the sheer relief experienced upon finally removing the thing after a long day of fighting, the feeling akin to shedding a second skin, a very heavy, metallic, and potentially rusty second skin. Let's consider the maintenance. Keeping chainmail in good condition was a task that demanded considerable effort. Each ring had to be carefully inspected for breaks or damage, and any repairs had to be made meticulously to prevent further unraveling. Imagine the scene. A knight, far from the glorious battlefield, hunched over his chainmail, painstakingly threading tiny rings together under the flickering light of a candle, cursing the day he chose a career in warfare. It was a labor-intensive process that required skill and patience, and quite frankly, a profound sense of masochism. And if one ring broke, it's likely that all sorts of problems would result. Furthermore, the effectiveness of chainmail as protection was debatable. While it offered some protection against slashing weapons, it was significantly less effective against thrusting weapons like spears and lances. A well-aimed thrust could easily pierce the gaps between the rings, rendering the entire suit of armor quite useless. It's like having a net to protect yourself from a barrage of baseball bats. It might stop some, but not all. And if the weapon is well aimed, it will definitely go through. Consider the unfortunate knight whose chainmail had a flaw in it. A missed stitch, a broken ring, a simple spear through the gap, and the knight's day was suddenly a lot worse. This was not the type of issue that could be easily dealt with on the battlefield either. The weight of chainmail also significantly impacted a knight's stamina and agility. In the heat of battle, exhaustion could quickly set in, leaving the warrior vulnerable. In other words, a well-placed spear could suddenly turn a knight into a very heavy, slightly melted statue. This is in stark contrast to the movies and TV shows, where knights are generally shown as being agile and quick. In reality, they were often quite slow and labored. The added weight would not only affect their maneuverability, but also their physical stamina in battles. A long day of fighting in that amount of armor would have led to many a soldier falling asleep on their feet. Beyond the practical limitations, chainmail also presented logistical challenges. Transporting and storing large quantities of chainmail for a sizable army was a monumental task. A sizable army could require tens of thousands of suits, and this would be incredibly difficult to transport, protect, and store. This would make a serious logistical nightmare, and it would be difficult to keep up with and replenish. Imagine the army wagons groaning under the weight of mountains of chainmail, inching their way across muddy roads, susceptible to all manner of accidents and mishaps. The possibility of the whole thing becoming damaged during transit is very high. One can only imagine the countless hours spent in cleaning, repairing, and maintaining such an army's worth of chainmail. Let's not forget the cost. Producing chainmail was a time-consuming and expensive process, requiring skilled artisans and vast quantities of raw materials. Only the wealthy could afford such a luxury, reinforcing its status as a symbol of wealth and power, rather than simply as practical combat attire. A poor knight might have had to settle for cheaper, less effective armor that could not provide him with the same protection and would likely end up costing them their life. It would even be reasonable to say that this contributed to the inequality in medieval warfare, where the poor would often end up fighting under far inferior conditions. The design itself was a testament to the ingenuity of medieval craftsmanship, but its limitations were undeniable. It was heavy, hot, inflexible, and surprisingly vulnerable. The romanticized image of knights in shining chainmail needs a healthy dose of reality. They weren't graceful warriors, effortlessly gliding across battlefields. They were sweating, uncomfortable warriors, hampered by their own armor. The idea of the dashing knight in shining armor, though a nice story, was largely a figment of imagination. It serves as a nice romantic image, but it doesn't reflect the reality of what it was actually like. The inherent limitations of chainmail led to the eventual development of plate armor, a much more effective, though equally impractical in its own way, form of protection. Yet, chainmail's legacy remains, a reminder of a time when military technology was a fascinating blend of ingenuity, practicality, and sheer, unadulterated discomfort. It stands as a testament to the human capacity for both creative innovation and a striking lack of appreciation for the benefits of a good ventilation system. Perhaps the knights should have considered adding some sort of cooling system into their armor. It's amazing what a little ingenuity can do. Chainmail, however, is just one example of the many impractical weapons and armors that were used in medieval warfare. There are many other examples, and each of them has its own interesting story to tell. It makes one wonder why this type of armor persisted for so long. The answer is, of course, fairly simple. They were better than nothing. But that doesn't mean that they were ideal. They certainly had their pros and cons, and they highlight the importance of innovation and technological advancement in military warfare. So chainmail was a bit of a sweaty, clanky mess, wasn't it? Let's move on to its successor, the seemingly impenetrable, yet surprisingly immobile plate armor. Plate armor. The image conjured is one of gleaming, polished steel, a knight seemingly impervious to the ravages of war, a majestic, almost mythical figure, standing as a testament to the peak of medieval defensive technology. But as with chainmail, the reality was somewhat less glamorous. Think of plate armor as a highly sophisticated, yet incredibly cumbersome suit of metal. Instead of thousands of interlocking rings, we now have large, meticulously crafted plates of steel, carefully fitted together to cover the entire body. Each piece was a marvel of craftsmanship, requiring considerable skill and precision to create. The sheer amount of metal involved was astounding, resulting in a suit of armor that could easily weigh upwards of 50-60 pounds, sometimes even more. This wasn't simply a matter of added weight. It was a fundamental change in how a knight moved, fought, and frankly, existed. Forget the nimble agility of a swordsman. A knight in full plate was more akin to a heavily armored tank, slow, deliberate, and incredibly difficult to maneuver. Try sprinting in a suit of full plate armor. I dare you. You'll find that you're less likely to run than you are to fall over. And if you do run, it will be so slowly that the enemy won't have to exert much effort to catch you. It's more of a slow, dignified shuffle than a dashing run. Imagine the simple act of mounting a horse. This wasn't a graceful leap into the saddle. It was a carefully orchestrated, often precarious climb, requiring a considerable amount of strength and coordination. Picture a knight painstakingly hoisting himself onto his steed, his legs likely aching, his breath growing short. Dismounting was just as challenging, a process that often involved a certain amount of unceremonious tumbling. It was quite common for the knights to fall off their horses, and this certainly posed a safety risk. And once mounted, the knight wasn't exactly known for his speed and agility. Picture a cavalry charge, a thunderous wave of armored knights bearing down on the enemy. In reality, this impressive spectacle was likely a somewhat slower affair, more of a heavily armored procession than a rapid assault. Their movement would have been slow and methodical, and certainly quite predictable. It was hard to be agile when you were essentially clad in a suit of metal. Their progress was significantly slower, and this gave the enemy plenty of opportunities to get out of the way and regroup. The battle itself presented its own unique challenges. Sword fighting in full plate was far less about swift, graceful movements and more about slow, powerful strikes. Forget the elegant flourishes and lightning fast parries of the movies. This was a brutal clash of steel, a test of strength and endurance rather than skill. Many a duel would be more of a pushing match than a quick series of sword swings. You would not be able to move fast in this armor, and this made it difficult to fight effectively. Furthermore, the armor itself wasn't entirely protective. There were several weak points, areas where the plates didn't quite meet, creating gaps in the armor that could be exploited by a skilled opponent. These areas included the joints, neck, and groin, unfortunate locations for weak spots in armor designed to provide overall protection. A well-placed thrust could easily penetrate the armor in these weak points, leaving the knight vulnerable. And what about the heat? While plate armor offered slightly better ventilation than chainmail, it was still far from comfortable, especially in the hot summer sun. A knight would find himself sweating profusely, his body overheating beneath the heavy weight of metal, quite literally cooked inside his own armor. It's quite likely that the knights would be dehydrated and overheated by the end of battle. This, quite understandably, would greatly impact their physical and mental well-being. It is likely that this factor could end up impacting the outcome of battle, and it certainly had an impact on a knight's longevity. The logistical problems associated with plate armor were even more significant than those of chainmail. The sheer weight and bulk of plate armor made transportation and storage a major undertaking. A large army required hundreds, even thousands of suits, adding substantially to the logistical burden on already stretched supply lines. Transporting such a vast amount of armor would require many wagons, which would make the army a lot more sluggish and vulnerable. This would likely add to their vulnerability and create opportunities for the enemy to attack. The cost of plate armor was also prohibitive, placing it firmly outside the reach of all but the wealthiest warriors. Only the elite could afford such an extravagant piece of protective gear, further reinforcing the social divide within medieval warfare. This is understandable, given the large amount of materials and labor required to make a full suit of plate armor. It took a team of skilled artisans quite a lot of time to create a single suit. The maintenance of plate armor was another significant challenge. The plates were prone to rust and damage, requiring regular cleaning and repair. A skilled armorer would need to keep track of all the parts and ensure that everything fits properly. If some of the plates were damaged, it could compromise the armor's overall protective function. Replacing damaged armor was also extremely expensive, and it could be difficult to replace it in the midst of battle. In short, plate armor, while a significant advancement over chainmail, was far from the invincible shield it is often portrayed as. It was heavy, cumbersome, hot, and surprisingly vulnerable. The knight encased within this magnificent suit of armor was less a graceful warrior and more a heavily armored, slow-moving, overheating human tank. An impressive sight, to be sure, but hardly the nimble, agile fighter of legend. The knights could only move slowly, and this was often a disadvantage in battle. They were essentially giant targets that were easily spotted, and this was a significant vulnerability. Their agility was hampered by the sheer amount of armor, and they could not move as fast as their opponents. It served as a symbol of status and wealth, rather than solely as a practical tool for defense. It was a testament to the skill and dedication of the medieval armorsmiths, but it was also a reminder of the limitations of technology at that time. While it certainly offered increased protection compared to chainmail, it came at the cost of mobility and agility. It is quite surprising that it was such a widely adopted form of armor, despite its shortcomings. The legacy of plate armor remains, a testament to the enduring human fascination with protective gear, and perhaps a reminder to appreciate the comparatively comfortable world of modern military attire. And who knows, perhaps one day we'll see a return of plate armor, with some much needed improvements, of course. Perhaps some sort of air conditioning system would be a good addition. It is remarkable how much technology has advanced since the medieval times. We have access to much more advanced materials and technology that allow for more effective and lightweight armor. It makes one wonder what the future of military technology will bring. The medieval period provided many interesting lessons about military technology, and these lessons are still relevant today. Now, let's delve into the headgear, the crowning glory, or perhaps the head-crushing folly of medieval military fashion. Helmets. Forget the sleek, aerodynamic designs of modern combat helmets. Medieval helmets were a glorious mess of practicality, and let's be honest, a touch of the absurd. Their evolution is a fascinating and often hilarious journey through the history of head protection. The earliest helmets, if you could even call them that, were little more than leather caps or bronze skull caps, offering about as much protection as a determined sneeze. Imagine facing a charging opponent, relying on a glorified baseball cap to shield your head. It wasn't exactly ideal. These early attempts at head protection were more like a statement of intent, a nod to the idea of protection rather than a serious attempt at achieving it. These rudimentary helmets were more of a symbolic gesture than a practical defensive measure. Then came the great helm, a truly magnificent and terrifying creation. Picture a bucket made of steel, so large it almost completely covered the wearer's head and shoulders. It was so large that you'd need a crane just to lift it onto your head. This massive headpiece provided exceptional protection, but also rendered the wearer completely blind and unable to hear anything other than the dull thud of their own heavy steps. If an enemy could even get close enough to land a hit, the result would be spectacular. But getting close enough was no mean feat, because the person wearing the great helm was essentially immobile. It's quite likely that this type of helmet did not enhance the wearer's ability to fight effectively in battle. Its primary function was likely more of a statement of power and wealth rather than actual protections in battle. One can imagine the comedic scenes that would have unfolded on the battlefield. Imagine a knight in a great helm trying to turn his head to see what's going on around him. The sheer weight and size of the helm would make such a movement rather challenging, if not impossible. If you were attempting to run or dodge attacks, it would have rendered you utterly immobile. The battlefield would be filled with slow-moving, clanking figures. It could hardly be classified as agile combat. This, of course, made them rather easy targets. The helmet's impracticality is self-evident. It was more of a status symbol than a genuine defensive asset. To improve visibility slightly, the great helm eventually evolved into the bassinet, a more streamlined and less bulky design that allowed for a more complete range of vision, though it still left the face exposed. Think of a medieval motorcycle helmet, minus the chin guard, and of course, the aesthetic beauty. The bassinet offered better practicality and a considerable improvement upon the great helm. The bassinet allowed for more agility and enabled the wearer to use their weapons with greater efficiency. However, it left the wearer's face exposed, rendering it vulnerable to attack. This was mitigated by the addition of a visor, or aventail, a metal plate covering the face, or a chainmail curtain protecting the neck and face. The visors themselves were a subject of much innovation and some questionable design choices. Some visors were simply narrow slits, providing minimal visibility but maximum protection from direct blows. Others were small enough that the knight would likely have to tilt his head at a very odd angle. Others were more ornate, with intricate designs and even small windows, perfect for demonstrating wealth and possibly confusing the enemy. One can imagine the confusion among the troops as they try to coordinate attacks with their fellow soldiers. In the midst of a battle, it would have been challenging for the knights to keep their heads straight and maintain a consistent formation. The battlefield would have resembled a game of blind man's bluff, only with the added thrill of deadly weapons. One cannot help but marvel at the determination of these warriors. Then there were the kettle hats, so named because they resembled, well, kettles. These were simpler, less expensive helmets, often worn by foot soldiers rather than the wealthy knights who could afford more elaborate headgear. The kettle hats certainly weren't aesthetically pleasing, but they served their purpose reasonably well. The medieval period also saw the rise of the salet, a helmet with a distinctly beaked or pointed front. This distinctive feature was not entirely without purpose. It did offer some additional protection to the nose, but it also gave the wearer an uncannily bird-like appearance. Imagine an army of knights charging into battle looking like a flock of particularly aggressive birds. The sight would have been quite comical, but it's quite possible that the birds would have been more effective at fighting than the knights were. And let's not forget the armet, a close-fitting helmet that fully enclosed the head and neck. It provided excellent protection, but was very cumbersome and significantly limited the wearer's field of vision. It was a bit of a trade-off, maximum protection for minimal awareness. The armet was a remarkable demonstration of engineering and defensive design, but its practicality is a subject of debate. The variety of medieval helmets underscores the era's diverse social classes and the differing needs and priorities of soldiers. While knights might adorn themselves with elaborate, heavily decorated helmets, a simple functional kettle hat often sufficed for a common foot soldier. The helmets were not just a reflection of the social status of the wearer, but also of their role in the army. It's quite fascinating to consider the evolution of helmets from their crude beginnings to their advanced, more sophisticated design. However, their functionality was often overshadowed by their style and design. It's clear that style and fashion played a significant role in their design. The knight's helmet was more of a fashion statement than a mere protective device. The practicality of these helmets varied wildly, ranging from the almost entirely useless to the surprisingly effective. Many were more style than substance, emphasizing the knight's social standing more than their actual protection in battle. However, some were exceptionally well-engineered pieces of defensive equipment that undoubtedly saved lives. However, despite their varied designs and levels of protection, the fundamental purpose of the helmet remained constant: to protect the head. It was the head, after all, that was most important. It was the brain housed within it that controlled the body, and its protection was therefore paramount. Without it, all else was lost. And that, my friends, is a point that transcends both the limitations of medieval technology and the occasionally absurd fashions of the time. The helmet, therefore, was far more than just a fashion statement. It represented the value placed upon life and the hope that one would survive to fight again another day. And in the often brutal realities of medieval warfare, that hope could often mean the difference between life and death. Now, having surveyed the head protecting or head hampering marvels of medieval helmets, let's move on to the bigger picture: full body armor. Forget the streamlined, lightweight materials of modern body armor. Medieval armor was a spectacle, a mobile fortress that often weighed more than the knight wearing it. The arms race, in this context, wasn't just about creating weapons that could pierce armor. It was also about creating armor that could withstand those weapons. And let's be honest, it was a bit of a fashion show too. The earliest forms of body armor were rather rudimentary. Imagine leather jackets, reinforced with layers of quilted fabric. Think of a medieval version of a biker's jacket, far less stylish and considerably less effective against a sword blow. These weren't exactly going to stop a lance at full tilt, but they were better than nothing. They offered a degree of protection, but one can imagine their effectiveness was questionable at best. Then came the mail, chainmail. That iconic image of medieval warfare was essentially thousands of tiny metal rings linked together to form a flexible, yet surprisingly tough, protective layer. It was the medieval equivalent of a high-tech bulletproof vest, though somewhat heavier and far less comfortable. The weight alone was enough to sap your strength, and the heat during a summer battle must have been unbearable. One can only imagine how difficult and uncomfortable it would have been to fight while wearing this full body armor. The production of chainmail was a labor of love, or perhaps a labor of pure tedium, requiring incredible skill and patience. Each ring had to be carefully interlocked with its neighbors, a process that required enormous amounts of time and meticulous attention to detail. A single suit of chainmail could take months, even years to make. This made it expensive and understandably prized by its owner. However, despite its remarkable flexibility and impressive protection against slashing weapons, chainmail had a fatal flaw: pointy things. A well-aimed lance, arrow, or sword thrust could easily find its way through the gaps between the rings. It was like a finely woven chain-link fence, great against many things, but not against a determined attacker with something sharp. The inevitable response to the piercing power of lances and swords was plate armor. This marked a significant leap forward in protective technology, though it involved a rather significant increase in weight. Instead of relying on interlocking rings, plate armor used large, overlapping plates of metal, carefully crafted and fitted to cover the entire body. This offered far superior protection against piercing attacks. But it came with a significant downside. A knight fully clad in plate armor was essentially a walking tank, slow, cumbersome, and incredibly hot. It wouldn't be long before knights had to take breaks mid-battle to cool off and avoid heat stroke. The evolution of plate armor was a testament to the ongoing arms race. As weapons improved, so did armor. Initially, plate armor was fairly simple, consisting of separate plates for the torso, limbs, and head. But as technology advanced, the design became more sophisticated, with improvements including the addition of articulated joints that enabled greater mobility. Imagine the development of plate armor like the development of the car. Initially, only a rudimentary model was built, and the new versions were then improved over the years to become more modern. The crafting of plate armor was a high art, requiring considerable skill and precision. The armorers were highly respected artisans, their creations representing both a significant investment and a symbol of the wearer's status. The artistry involved in creating plate armor is truly amazing. The intricate designs, the precision of the fit, and the high level of skill involved in its creation made it a true work of art. Plate armor was more than just protection. It was a status symbol, a testament to the wearer's wealth and power. It represented a knight's social standing and their position in society. However, even the most expertly crafted plate armor had its limitations. While it provided excellent protection against piercing weapons, it was still vulnerable to powerful blows from blunt weapons like maces and war hammers. And of course, there was the ever-present issue of weight. A fully plated knight could easily weigh over 100 pounds, with their armor severely restricting their mobility. Imagine trying to fight wearing a suit of armor that weighs more than the knight. This would surely restrict the mobility of the knight, and hence his combat effectiveness. This was a severe detriment to the wearer's ability to maneuver efficiently on the battlefield, especially in close quarters combat. The arms race between armor and weaponry continued throughout the medieval period. As armor became more protective, weapons became more powerful. This led to a cyclical development, with each side constantly trying to outdo the other. This, in turn, led to some truly absurd designs. We've already looked at helmets. Imagine the same principle applied to body armor. Some knights adorned themselves with extravagant armor, decorated with intricate designs and precious metals. This wasn't simply about protection. It was about showing off wealth and status. The more ornate the armor, the higher one's social status, demonstrating the wearer's wealth and influence. It's akin to owning a luxurious sports car. One can imagine the knights parading their armor in competitions and tournaments, showcasing their wealth and power. The armor itself would be a demonstration of wealth and power, showing one's ability to invest in such high-quality armor. It's almost ironic that the best armor would often weigh more than the knight himself. This would serve as a symbol of the wearer's wealth. The tournaments provided an ideal setting to show off the armor and provide a demonstration of skill. The absurdity is compounded by the fact that this elaborate armor often made the knights less effective in actual combat. The weight and restrictions on movement could easily negate any advantage offered by the armor's protection. It was a bit like wearing a full suit of chainmail under a full suit of plate armor, protection in excess, and functionality seriously hampered. The impracticality of the situation was clearly evident. The arms race, therefore, was not just a competition of defensive and offensive capabilities. It was also a theatrical display of wealth and status. Medieval knights and soldiers were not just warriors, they were fashion icons, their armor as much a statement of social standing as a means of protection. This blend of practicality and ostentation, of protection and performance, is what makes the evolution of medieval armor so fascinating and often so hilariously impractical. In the end, the knight who was best equipped wasn't always the knight who won. Sometimes it was the knight who could still move after he'd donned his excessively decorated, incredibly heavy armor. So you've got your gleaming plate armor, a testament to your wealth and, let's be honest, your questionable fashion sense. You look like a walking refrigerator, radiating an air of intimidating yet slightly sweaty authority. But the battle is far from over. The real fight begins after the tournament, after the joust, after you've narrowly avoided being flattened by a runaway warhorse. The fight, my friends, is against rust, grime, and the sheer unrelenting weight of your own personal fortress. Armor maintenance was not for the faint of heart or the lazy. It was a knight's most demanding chore, a daily ritual that tested patience, strength, and the occasional ability to perform minor miracles. Forget the romantic notion of a knight shining his armor by moonlight. That was probably reserved for those who had servants. Most knights, particularly those who weren't ridiculously wealthy, found themselves wrestling with their own cumbersome equipment. First, the stripping down. This wasn't a quick undress. It was a methodical disassembly, a painstaking process of unbuckling straps, removing articulated joints, and generally feeling like a medieval transformer attempting self-repair. Each piece, from the breastplate to the greaves, those shin guards that probably chafed like nobody's business, had to be carefully separated, inspected for damage, and prepared for the next stage, the cleaning. Think of cleaning a suit of armor as attempting to clean a very expensive, very heavy set of tools after a particularly muddy gardening job. Except the garden is a battlefield, and the tools can crush a man. The cleaning process was a brutal affair. First came the scrubbing. This involved copious amounts of water, brushes of varying stiffness, depending on the level of grime and the knight's patience, and likely some sort of abrasive substance, perhaps sand or perhaps finely ground bone. No gentle dish soap here. This was a battle against the elements, against dirt ingrained from weeks, months, or perhaps even years of wear. Imagine the smell. The interior of the armor was particularly challenging. The heat and sweat trapped inside would have fostered a breeding ground for anything from unpleasant odors to potentially dangerous bacteria. The cleaning, then, was not simply cosmetic. It was essential for hygiene and for preventing skin irritation. This wasn't a job for the squeamish. Cleaning the inside of a suit of armor, particularly one that had been worn extensively in battle, was a gruesome undertaking involving the removal of dried blood, mud, and other unpleasant substances. One can only imagine the aromas produced during this process. After the scrubbing came the polishing. This was where the armor truly transformed from a rusty, mud-caked behemoth to something resembling, very faintly, the shining glory its owner might have envisioned. Polishing required a high level of skill, not just physical strength, but an artist's eye and the patience of a saint. The materials for polishing were varied, ranging from simple cloths to specialized pastes and polishes that would have been expensive and painstakingly created. This was not something to be taken lightly, as poorly executed polishing could damage the armor. The results of a well-polished suit of armor were worth the effort. It was not merely a reflection of one's wealth or status. It was also a sign of a knight's dedication, his commitment to the upkeep of his equipment. The gleam was a symbol of military preparedness, signaling to potential enemies that they faced an opponent who was both well protected and disciplined enough to maintain his protective gear. This reflected the level of meticulousness the knight put into maintaining his weaponry. But polishing wasn't just an aesthetic exercise, it was essential for maintenance. The very process of polishing helped to prevent rust and corrosion, prolonging the life of the armor. A well-polished suit of armor was more than just a visually striking display of wealth and prestige. It also represented a commitment to the rigorous upkeep of one's equipment, reflecting the skill and discipline of a professional warrior. Of course, cleaning and polishing were only half the battle. Repairing dents, repairing cracks, and replacing damaged parts were also critical components of armor maintenance. This required skill and expertise in the armorer's services. Dents, though aesthetically displeasing, could compromise the structural integrity of the armor. A poorly repaired dent could lead to a fatal injury in battle. Replacing damaged parts could be costly and time-consuming. It is therefore evident that the upkeep of armor was a significant undertaking, requiring both time and expense. In addition to the cost of repairing the damaged parts, it is important to consider the financial investment needed to acquire new or replacement parts. The time and expense required in repairing a suit of armor would often be comparable to the cost of purchasing the armor itself. Medieval armor was a complex system of interwoven plates, hinges, and rivets, requiring a detailed knowledge of its construction to perform repairs effectively. Simple dents could be hammered out, but more serious damage required advanced metalworking skills, and perhaps even the recasting of entire sections. The repair of a suit of armor was not a task to be undertaken lightly. It demanded the skills of a highly trained and experienced armorer. A knight's armor was an investment, a considerable one in both time and money. Losing a piece of armor meant a significant expense to replace it, not just monetarily, but also in the time needed to have it custom made by an experienced armorer. This further illustrates the demanding nature of armor maintenance. It was more than just cleaning and polishing. It was a constant cycle of inspection, repair, and replacement that demanded considerable resources. The whole process, from dismantling to reassembly, could take hours, even days, depending on the extent of the damage. And let's not forget the sheer physical exertion involved. Imagine hoisting those heavy plates, scrubbing away at the grime, and meticulously polishing each surface. Knights were warriors, yes, but they were also surprisingly skilled artisans in their own right, possessing the strength, patience, and technical expertise to maintain their own personal arsenals. Imagine the frustration of a particularly stubborn rust stain, or the sheer agony of attempting to maneuver a stiff, mud-caked greave back into position. Armor maintenance was a grueling, often frustrating process, demanding both physical and mental stamina. It was a testament to the dedication of the knights who undertook this daily ritual, a dedication that often went unseen and unappreciated, overshadowed by the glory of battle. Yet, without this meticulous maintenance, the most impressive suit of armor would become as useless as a dented cooking pot, rendering the knight vulnerable. This is why we should look upon the magnificent and often absurd armor of the medieval period, not just as symbols of power and prestige, but also as a testament to the unglamorous, often backbreaking work that went into keeping them functional. It wasn't just about looking the part, it was about surviving the part. The daily grind of armor maintenance was as crucial to a knight's success as his swordsmanship, his horsemanship, or his ability to avoid accidentally impaling himself on his own lance. And that, my friends, is a far less glamorous, but far more realistic view of the medieval knight. Chapter 4, Lessons Learned, mostly about not doing that again. Now, having wrestled with the complexities of medieval armor maintenance, a task more akin to a medieval car mechanic than a dashing knight errant, let's turn our attention to the weaponry itself. And here, my friends, the absurdities truly begin. Imagine a battlefield, a chaotic maelstrom of clashing steel, screaming men, and the occasional panicked horse. Now picture a knight, clad in his painstakingly cleaned and polished armor, brandishing a weapon so unwieldy, so utterly impractical, that it's a wonder anyone ever managed to inflict damage with it. We're talking about the Zweihänder, a great sword so long it required the strength of a small ox to wield effectively. Think of it as a medieval equivalent of trying to fight a duel using a length of telephone pole. The Zweihänder was a magnificent beast of a weapon, all imposing length and impressive weight. It was a statement piece, a symbol of raw power, and a testament to the medieval obsession with bigger is better, even when better wasn't actually better at all. Picture the sheer effort required to even lift this thing, let alone swing it with any degree of accuracy. It wasn't a weapon for quick strikes or nimble footwork. It was a weapon for slow, deliberate swings, the kind that required the knight to plant his feet firmly and hope his opponent didn't have the foresight to simply step out of the way. And the accuracy? Let's just say it wasn't renowned. The sheer size and weight of the Zweihänder made precision strikes exceedingly difficult. It was more likely to send a knight flailing wildly, exhausting himself and exposing himself to counterattacks. Think of it as a medieval equivalent of the oversized golf club, impressive to look at, but rarely used effectively. It's not that it was totally useless. A well-placed swing could certainly do some serious damage. However, its usefulness was largely offset by the difficulty of actually landing a well-placed swing. Then we have the bombards, early cannons that were often so oversized and so poorly designed that they were as likely to injure the operator as they were to harm the enemy. These weren't your sleek, precision-engineered cannons. These were behemoths of bronze or iron, often crudely cast and prone to exploding with spectacular and often deadly results. Firing a bombard was a risky affair. It demanded a significant amount of skill, patience, and a healthy dose of luck. The recoil alone could send the gun crew sprawling, and a misfire could transform the cannon into a rather expensive and deadly projectile. Imagine the scene: a battlefield already thick with chaos, and then suddenly a huge puff of smoke, followed by a deafening roar, and then a shower of sparks and molten metal, followed by the sound of panicked screaming of the gun crew who were just sent flying backward. It was, in many respects, a weapon of mass disruption, more likely to cause friendly fire casualties than enemy deaths. They were more impressive as displays of technological capability than as effective tools of war. The sheer effort and resources required to produce these behemoths often outweighed the actual impact they had on the battlefield. And let's not forget the morning stars, those rather comical-looking weapons that resembled a spiked metal ball attached to a chain. While undeniably brutal in close combat, their effectiveness was heavily dependent on the skill of the user. A skilled warrior could inflict devastating damage with a morning star, but an unskilled one was just as likely to entangle himself in the chain, becoming a target for his foes. It was a weapon that required a high level of training and coordination to wield effectively. Unlike the sophisticated weaponry of modern warfare, the Morning Star demanded a degree of physical prowess and strategic thinking that was rarely found in untrained soldiers. The evolution of warfare is, in many ways, a story of the gradual elimination of the absurd, a constant refinement of weapon design and tactical thinking. We went from unwieldy swords and haphazard cannons to precision-engineered rifles and guided missiles. Modern warfare, while undoubtedly horrific, is also far more efficient, far less reliant on sheer brute force, and, it must be said, considerably less funny. The contrast is stark. Consider the medieval knight, lumbering around in his heavy armor, swinging his oversized greatsword, a valiant but often comical figure. Now compare him to a modern soldier, equipped with advanced weaponry, communication technology, and tactical training. The difference isn't just in the technology, it's in the approach to warfare itself. Medieval battles were often chaotic melees, with little in the way of strategic planning. Modern warfare is more about precision, coordination, and technological superiority. The emphasis has shifted from brute strength and luck to calculated strategy and technological advantage. The medieval soldier relied heavily on individual strength and skill. Success was often determined by individual prowess in combat. Modern warfare, however, emphasizes teamwork, coordination, and technological advantages. The effectiveness of a modern soldier relies not only on their individual training, but also on their ability to integrate seamlessly within a larger combat unit, utilizing advanced communication systems and weapons to achieve their objectives. This shift reflects not only a change in technology, but also a change in military organization and strategy. Medieval armies were often feudal levies, made up of poorly trained and poorly equipped soldiers. Modern armies are highly trained, well-equipped professional fighting forces with sophisticated organizational structures. The medieval battlefield was a place of chaos and confusion. Modern warfare is characterized by greater levels of coordination and planning. This evolution isn't simply about the weapons themselves, it's about the entire process of warfare. Medieval warfare was characterized by personal combat, whereas modern warfare is frequently distant, often involving high-tech weaponry and precision strikes. The medieval battlefield was a chaotic clash of individuals, while modern warfare is a far more coordinated and technological affair. The contrast extends to logistics, too. Medieval armies relied on foraging and plunder for supplies, while modern armies possess intricate supply chains that can sustain operations across vast distances. The contrast highlights the significance of technology in shaping the conduct of modern warfare. This evolution showcases the continuous refinement and adaptation of military strategies throughout history, driven by technological innovation and military doctrine. The change also reflects a shift in the nature of warfare itself. Medieval battles were often fought for personal glory, land, or religious zeal. Modern warfare is often driven by complex political and ideological motivations, though personal agendas may still play a role, albeit in a far more intricate and less easily defined manner. Modern warfare is vastly more complex, influenced by diverse political and ideological factors. The transformation from the clumsy to the clever is a testament to human ingenuity, but also to the enduring nature of conflict itself. The weapons may have changed, the tactics may have evolved, but the human desire to dominate, to control, to wage war, that remains a constant. And even with all the technological advances, some things remain surprisingly similar. The desire for glory, the thrill of the fight, and the constant need for a good cleaning crew after the battle is over. Just imagine trying to clean a modern tank. The sheer scale is rather daunting. Let's leave the lumbering Zweihänder and the self-destructive bombards behind for a moment and consider the broader implications of medieval weapon design. The overarching theme, my friends, is a profound lack of practicality. It wasn't just individual weapons. The entire approach to weaponry seemed driven by aesthetics and symbolism rather than genuine effectiveness. Size, as we've seen, was often equated with power, leading to the creation of weapons that were impressive to behold but utterly impractical to use. Think of the medieval siege engine. While undeniably impressive in their scale, some were colossal affairs requiring teams of men to operate. Their accuracy was often lacking. Imagine the painstaking effort involved in constructing these behemoths, hauling them to the battlefield, assembling them, and then finally launching a projectile that might, or might not, hit the intended target. A direct hit was far from guaranteed. More often than not, the projectile would land somewhere harmlessly in a field, leaving the besieged to chuckle at the attacker's expense. It was less a precision instrument and more a hopeful gesture, a medieval equivalent of throwing a very large and very expensive dart. And the sheer logistics. Transporting these siege engines was a logistical nightmare, requiring considerable manpower and resources. Imagine the procession, a slow-moving, creaking convoy of these massive machines, vulnerable to ambushes and sabotage. Their effectiveness was often negated by the sheer difficulty of getting them to where they were needed. The effort required to build, transport, and operate these siege weapons frequently outweighed the tactical advantage they provided. This brings us to another crucial aspect, the limitations of medieval metallurgy. The materials available to medieval smiths were simply not as consistent or refined as those available today. This often resulted in weapons that were prone to breakage, particularly under stress. Imagine the dismay of a knight whose massive, meticulously crafted sword snaps in two during a crucial duel. His investment in the weapon is wasted, and he's now defenseless against his opponent. The reliability of medieval weapons was far from guaranteed. A modern soldier, by contrast, has a high degree of confidence in the reliability of their weapons, a level of reliability almost inconceivable in the medieval period. Consider the chainmail of the medieval knight, supposedly impenetrable armor, yet vulnerable to a well-placed thrust or a determined opponent. It was heavy, cumbersome, restrictive, and prone to rust. Maintaining chainmail was a significant undertaking, as any medieval armorer would readily attest. A knight's armor wasn't just for show, it was a constant companion, requiring meticulous care and attention, much like a modern car or a complex piece of machinery. The contrast between medieval and modern weaponry is striking, a testament to centuries of technological advancement. Medieval weapons, often magnificent in their size and craftsmanship, were often hampered by their impracticality. Modern weapons, on the other hand, are designed for efficiency, reliability, and accuracy. The difference is not just in the materials and manufacturing techniques. It is a fundamental shift in the approach to warfare. Medieval warfare was a brutal, chaotic affair, relying heavily on individual strength, courage, and a fair bit of luck. Modern warfare, while still undeniably brutal, is far more strategic, reliant on technology, coordination, and precision. Medieval soldiers depended on brute force, while modern soldiers rely on advanced technology and tactics. The evolution from the unwieldy to the efficient is a testament to the incredible power of innovation and engineering. The shift reflects not only technological advancements, but also a change in military organization, strategy, and even the very philosophy of warfare. Medieval armies were often disparate collections of feudal levies, poorly trained and inconsistently equipped. Modern armies are highly trained professional forces, meticulously organized and equipped with advanced technology. This transition is not merely a matter of replacing swords with rifles. It's a complete transformation of the way war is conducted. It's a shift from individual combat to coordinated operations, from rudimentary tactics to sophisticated strategies, and from haphazard logistics to highly efficient supply chains. The change isn't just in the weapons themselves, but in the entire military apparatus. The difference is less about individual might and more about collective effort, technological superiority, and strategic planning. Furthermore, the context of war has changed dramatically. Medieval warfare was often localized, driven by personal ambitions, territorial disputes, or religious conflicts. Modern warfare is often global in scope, driven by complex geopolitical factors and frequently involving extensive technological and logistical considerations. The difference extends beyond the battlefield itself. The support systems, the training, the logistics, the overall organization all have undergone a radical transformation. A medieval army might forage for food, relying on plunder and local resources. A modern army, however, requires intricate and far-reaching supply lines, ensuring its soldiers are supplied with everything from ammunition and food to advanced medical care. The logistics alone represent a breathtaking leap in sophistication and scale. This transformation in warfare is a story not just of technological progress, but also of strategic evolution. The very nature of combat has changed, shifting from close quarters fighting to long-range precision strikes, from individual duels to coordinated assaults. Modern warfare involves sophisticated intelligence gathering, advanced communication systems, and comprehensive tactical planning. Finally, let us not forget the sheer cost. The creation of a medieval weapon, even a relatively simple one, was a labor-intensive process. Skilled smiths, often working for months, were required to craft a single sword or piece of armor. Modern weapons, while also requiring skilled labor, benefit from mass production techniques and advanced manufacturing technologies, significantly reducing the cost per unit while increasing overall effectiveness. The contrast between medieval and modern weaponry highlights a fundamental truth about warfare: the relentless pursuit of efficiency. The evolution from clumsy, impractical weapons to highly sophisticated and effective tools of war reflects not just technological progress, but also a deepening understanding of the strategic, logistical, and tactical requirements of conflict. The journey from the unwieldy Zweihänder to the precision-engineered assault rifle is a powerful illustration of the continuing quest for dominance and control. A journey marked by remarkable ingenuity, surprising failures, and a profound appreciation for the power of practicality, and perhaps a quiet gratitude that we don't have to clean a chainmail hauberk after every skirmish. So we've established that medieval weaponry was, shall we say, enthusiastic rather than efficient. But the misconceptions surrounding this era of warfare go far beyond just oversized swords and temperamental cannons. Let's delve into the realm of popular myths and misconceptions, armed not with a Zweihänder, thank goodness, but with a healthy dose of historical accuracy and a generous helping of wry amusement. First, let's tackle the noble knight in shining armor, the stalwart defender of Christendom, often portrayed as practically invincible. The reality, my friends, was significantly less glamorous. That shining armor was often more rusty and surprisingly heavy armor. Maintaining a suit of plate armor was a full-time job, requiring constant polishing, oiling, and repair. Imagine the logistical nightmare of a knight's personal valet, lugging around cleaning supplies and spare rivets alongside the already weighty armor. And let's not forget the heat. A fully enclosed suit of armor in the summer sun of a medieval battlefield must have been less than pleasant. It's a far cry from the romanticized image of a dashing warrior effortlessly galloping into battle, more like a sweaty, overheated man struggling to breathe in a metal oven. Then there's the myth of the perfectly disciplined, highly trained medieval army, marching in neat formations, executing complex maneuvers with clockwork precision. Forget it. Medieval armies were more akin to a disorganized mob than a well-oiled machine. Feudal levies, obligated to serve their lords for a limited period, often lacked proper training, consistent equipment, and most importantly, any real sense of unit cohesion. Coordination on a battlefield was often non-existent. Battles resembled more of a chaotic scrum than a strategic engagement. Imagine a vast, unruly throng of men in mismatched armor, wielding a variety of weapons, all more or less trying to kill each other but with little actual strategy or direction. It was essentially a very large and poorly organized brawl, often decided more by luck and sheer numbers than by tactical brilliance. Another persistent misconception is the prevalence of epic, meticulously planned battles, with both sides engaging in a grand, glorious clash of arms. In reality, many medieval battles were short, brutal affairs, decided not by hours of pitched combat, but by swift charges, flanking maneuvers that often went awry, or a sudden rout. The concept of a protracted, drawn-out battle, like those depicted in countless movies, was far less common. Think less Braveheart and more a slightly less organized bar fight. Battles were often messy, unpredictable affairs, determined as much by chance as by strategy. And let's not forget the legendary siege warfare, those epic standoffs depicted in countless medieval tales. While sieges did occur, the reality was often less glamorous and more frustrating than popular imagination suggests. Successful sieges required immense resources, incredible patience, and a good deal of luck. Prolonged sieges could last for months or even years, resulting in considerable loss of life on both sides from disease, starvation, and dysentery rather than combat. A successful siege was more a testament to endurance and attrition than to superior military prowess. It was less about glorious military strategy and more about slowly starving your opponents into submission. The successful siege was more of a battle of wills and resources than a display of tactical brilliance. The idea that all medieval soldiers were fearless, unwavering warriors, eager to charge into battle without a second thought, is another fallacy. While undoubtedly many soldiers possessed bravery, fear was a natural and common emotion. Deserting a battle was surprisingly common, and battles were often won or lost, not just by brute force, but also by the psychological state of the soldiers involved. The romanticized image of the courageous knight charging fearlessly into the fray often obscures the reality of human nature on the battlefield, a mix of fear, adrenaline, and often a considerable amount of panic. Soldiers, medieval or modern, are humans first and warriors second. Moreover, the supposed invincibility of medieval castles is also a myth. While castles were impressive structures designed for defense, they were far from impregnable. Clever tactics, superior siege engines, even if those engines were notoriously inaccurate, or simply a prolonged siege could often overcome even the strongest defenses. Castles were more of a deterrent than impenetrable fortresses. The saying, "A castle is only as strong as its weakest point," was certainly apt for medieval castles. The prevalence of hand-to-hand combat is another misconception. While close quarters combat was undoubtedly a significant element of medieval warfare, ranged weapons like bows and crossbows played a far more crucial role than often portrayed. The effectiveness of ranged weaponry was often underestimated. A well-placed arrow or bolt could cripple or kill an enemy at a distance, negating the need for a dangerous and often messy close-range encounter. The medieval battlefield was a mix of ranged and close-quarters combat, a dynamic interaction between archers, crossbowmen, and infantry. In conclusion, The reality of medieval warfare was often considerably less romantic and far more chaotic and brutal than popular culture suggests. The myths and misconceptions surrounding this era of warfare obscure the practical challenges, the logistical complexities, and the surprising lack of coordination that often characterized medieval battles. It was a world where size wasn't always might, where planning often fell short, and where the outcome of a battle frequently hinged on luck rather than strategy. So, next time you see a depiction of a medieval battle, remember the reality: less shining armor, more muddy boots, less perfect formations, more chaotic scrambles, less valiant charges, and more surprising retreats. And perhaps, just perhaps, a quiet appreciation for the relative efficiency of modern weaponry. After all, who wants to spend hours cleaning chainmail? Now, having dissected the myths and misconceptions surrounding medieval warfare, let's take a moment to appreciate the sheer, glorious absurdity of it all. We've journeyed through a landscape of oversized swords, temperamental cannons, and armies that resembled disorganized mobs more than finely tuned fighting machines. We've witnessed the logistical nightmares of maintaining rusty armor, the unpredictability of battlefield engagements, and the often dismal success rate of sieges. And yet, amidst the chaos and inefficiency, there's a certain charm, a quirky, almost lovable incompetence that makes the whole thing strangely endearing. Consider the humble trebuchet, for instance, a magnificent, towering contraption designed to hurl massive projectiles over castle walls. In theory, a marvel of medieval engineering. In practice, well, let's just say its accuracy was variable. More often than not, a trebuchet's projectile would land somewhere completely unintended, perhaps in a friendly camp, a neighboring village, or if exceptionally lucky, somewhere vaguely in the direction of the intended target. The sheer unpredictability of these siege engines must have kept everyone on their toes, enemy and ally alike. Imagine the poor souls responsible for aiming these things. The pressure, the potential for friendly fire. It was a high-stakes game of medieval projectile-based bingo, and the celebratory whoops upon successfully hitting anything vaguely close to the enemy would have been truly remarkable. Then there are the various forms of early firearms, the bombards and the hand cannons. These primitive cannons were often as dangerous to their own operators as they were to the enemy. The unpredictable recoil, the potential for misfires, the sheer volume of smoke produced. These weapons were less instruments of precise warfare and more elaborate, and often disastrous, fireworks displays. One can almost picture the medieval equivalent of a safety officer frantically waving a flag, warning bystanders to seek cover from the inevitable errant cannonball or explosion. It was a risky business, being a medieval artilleryman, a job description that should likely have included expect sudden and explosive death in the fine print. The sheer amount of effort, resources, and manpower poured into creating these often ineffective weapons is also remarkable. Imagine the countless hours spent forging those enormous swords, the meticulous work of crafting intricate suits of armor, only to find that they were too heavy and cumbersome to be of any real use. The arduous task of transporting and assembling the unwieldy siege engines across treacherous terrain. It's a testament to the human capacity for both ingenuity and stubborn persistence in the face of overwhelming odds. It was like building a complex, intricate Rube Goldberg machine purely for the sake of making things more complicated than necessary. And the sheer number of people involved. It wasn't just a few skilled blacksmiths and engineers. Entire communities contributed to the creation and maintenance of these weapons. Farmers abandoned their fields to work in forges. Craftsmen diverted their talents to crafting siege weapons, and soldiers spent months training with tools that were frequently less than reliable. The entire medieval society, in a sense, was geared towards producing these often impractical, sometimes ludicrous tools of war. This colossal commitment of resources to such unreliable weaponry is a testament to the scale of belief that these weapons would somehow be the key to military success. Perhaps a certain level of blind faith was as much a factor in medieval warfare as the weapons themselves. The sheer determination to maintain the illusion of military prowess might have been a larger factor in the continuation of these less than effective weapons than any practical military advantages they held. But let's not forget the social aspects. These weapons were not just tools of war, they were status symbols. Owning a massive, ornate greatsword, a beautifully crafted suit of armor, or a fearsome bombard was a demonstration of wealth, power, and prestige. The size and extravagance of the weaponry directly reflected the status of its owner, a rather unfortunate and ironic correlation where impressive size meant little in the effectiveness on the battlefield, but a considerable amount in displaying wealth and social standing. It's a reminder that even in the midst of brutal warfare, appearances mattered. The impracticality of these weapons was somewhat compensated by their role in displays of wealth and social standing. Now contrast all of this with the modern military. The precision, the efficiency, the sheer technological advancement. It's a world away from the chaotic, often ludicrous weaponry of the medieval period. Modern weapons are designed with functionality and effectiveness in mind. They are meticulously tested, constantly refined, and built with the latest technology. The emphasis is on accuracy, range, and lethality, not on sheer size or ostentatious display. A modern soldier might not evoke the same romantic image as a knight in shining armor, but they are far, far more effective and efficient, with far less likelihood of accidentally harming themselves or their allies. The precision-guided munitions, the advanced communication systems, the sophisticated logistics. It's a stark contrast to the medieval reliance on brute force, luck, and sheer numbers. The modern military is a finely tuned machine, a testament to human ingenuity and technological progress. While medieval warfare had its moments of bravery, its occasional victories, and its sheer, compelling absurdity, there is no real comparison between the efficiency and precision of modern warfare and the often clumsy and inefficient tools of the medieval world. Perhaps the greatest lesson we can learn from the medieval period isn't just about the technology itself, but about how our understanding and application of technology has changed over time. Think of the difference between a medieval archer painstakingly nocking an arrow, aiming with minimal technology, and hoping for the best, and a modern sniper using sophisticated optics and ballistics to eliminate a target from miles away. The difference is not just in the weaponry itself, but in the entire system of support, training, and logistics that allows modern militaries to function with incredible precision and effectiveness. Medieval warfare was a brutal, messy, and often unpredictable affair, whereas the precision and lethality of modern warfare are a significant advancement in the evolution of human conflict, even if that advance is a morally complicated one. So, as we bring this exploration of medieval weaponry to a close, let us raise a glass, preferably one filled with something considerably less potent than 15th century ale, to the absurdity of it all. Let us chuckle at the oversized swords, the temperamental cannons, and the hilariously inaccurate trebuchets. And let us offer a final, grateful salute to the relative efficiency of modern arms. After all, who wants to spend their days cleaning chainmail when a modern rifle is available? We can appreciate the ingenuity and effort that went into the development of medieval weaponry, but we can also acknowledge that perhaps the concept of bigger is not always better in matters of military technology, and that, when it comes to warfare, efficiency trumps grandeur every time. The sheer comical ineptitude of some medieval weaponry should provide a stark reminder of how far military technology has advanced, even if those advances are not always used for peaceful purposes. Now that we've traversed the hilariously haphazard world of medieval weaponry, you might be left with a burning desire to delve even deeper into this fascinating and often absurd realm of history. Fear not, intrepid reader, for your quest for knowledge does not end here. The world of medieval military history is vast, and there's a whole arsenal of resources waiting to be explored. For the armchair strategist with a penchant for the peculiar, I heartily recommend starting with books that focus on the logistical nightmares of medieval warfare. Imagine the sheer challenge of transporting a fully assembled siege engine across muddy fields or treacherous mountain passes. Picture the logistical headaches of supplying an army with enough food, water, and perhaps most importantly, ale. These were not minor inconveniences, but rather monumental tasks that often dictated the success or failure of a campaign. Think about the procurement and supply chain of, say, 500 suits of armor, the sheer weight of the material, the need to locate suitable metals, the skills and time needed to produce such things. It staggers the imagination. Several excellent works explore this often overlooked aspect of medieval warfare, offering a fascinating glimpse into the logistical challenges faced by medieval armies. You'll find yourself appreciating the efficiency of modern supply chains in a whole new light after grappling with the medieval equivalent. Next, let's talk about those magnificent, if somewhat unpredictable, siege weapons. Beyond the trebuchet's infamous inaccuracy, there's a wealth of information on the design, construction, and operation of these impressive machines. Books dedicated to siege warfare offer a more technical perspective on the engineering marvels and occasional catastrophic failures of these medieval engines of destruction. Many sources explore the design of the trebuchet and its evolution, revealing the surprisingly sophisticated engineering behind these seemingly simple machines. They also discuss other forms of siege weaponry, like the battering ram, the mangonel, and the mining and sapping techniques used to undermine castle walls. These techniques, while sometimes incredibly effective, often involved a level of danger that seems almost comical from a modern perspective. Imagine digging under a castle wall, waiting for it to collapse on you, or attempting to breach a wall with a massive wooden log. The amount of sheer bravery and stupidity involved deserves to be documented in great detail. For those interested in the social and cultural aspects of medieval weaponry, there are numerous resources exploring the role of arms and armor in medieval society. These books move beyond the purely technical aspects of weaponry and delve into the social status associated with owning specific types of weapons and the use of those weapons in displays of power and prestige. The ostentatious display of weaponry wasn't just about intimidation, it was a fundamental aspect of medieval social hierarchy. The size and ornamentation of a knight's sword or armor often communicated his wealth and social standing more effectively than any verbal declaration. Consider the lengths some warriors went to in order to create such impressive, yet impractical displays of wealth and military power. A good historical analysis of this cultural element of medieval weaponry offers a surprising counterpoint to the practical and efficient approach modern arms and military strategies take. Beyond books, a wealth of additional resources await. Museums around the world house impressive collections of medieval weaponry, from beautifully crafted swords to imposing suits of armor. These museums offer a chance to see these fascinating objects up close and personal, gaining a tangible understanding of their size, weight, and complexity. Virtual museum tours and online databases can allow you to explore these collections from the comfort of your own home, providing detailed information and high-resolution images that allow you to examine the intricate details of medieval weaponry. Many museum websites allow 360-degree views of armor and weapons, including some examples that have survived for centuries. Documentaries and historical films, while often taking creative liberties, can still provide a visually engaging and entertaining introduction to the subject. Many offer stunning visuals of reenactments and recreations of medieval battles, battles that provide an opportunity to witness the chaotic and often unpredictable nature of medieval combat. It's easy to get caught up in the visual spectacle of recreations, but it is important to remember that the reality of medieval combat would have been much less spectacular and would have involved far more blood, less swordplay, and far fewer heroic moments. Finally, don't underestimate the power of academic journals and scholarly articles. While less accessible to the casual reader, these resources offer the most in-depth and rigorous analysis of specific aspects of medieval weaponry and warfare. These journals and articles might seem daunting, but they offer some incredible insight into highly specialized aspects of medieval weaponry and warfare, and often provide very useful and fascinating conclusions. So, there you have it, intrepid reader. Your journey into the hilariously impractical world of medieval weaponry is far from over. With the plethora of resources available, you can continue to explore this fascinating and often absurd realm of history, armed with knowledge and a healthy dose of amusement. Happy reading, and may your research be as fruitful and perhaps less dangerous than a medieval siege. And remember, always check the historical accuracy of sources. Just because something is depicted in a movie or a book doesn't automatically make it true. Remember to always approach historical sources with a critical eye, comparing information from multiple sources and considering the biases of the authors and the context of the information. Some sources might glamorize medieval warfare, while others focus on its brutal reality. The key is to synthesize information from different sources to paint a more complete and hopefully hilarious picture. Medieval history, and medieval military history in particular, is filled with wonderfully colorful characters and incredibly absurd circumstances. Don't hesitate to look for those unique details and anecdotes that bring the past to life. It's through those smaller details that you truly appreciate the human element of the time period, the individuals, their lives, their choices, and their struggles. Remember the impracticality of the weapons themselves and how this often undermined military success, the logistical challenges faced by medieval armies, the reliance on outdated strategies, and the sheer unpredictability of medieval battles. These are all elements that provide ample opportunities for humorous observation and insightful analysis. And finally, don't be afraid to let your imagination run wild. Use your research as inspiration for creative writing projects, fictional stories, or even humorous historical memes. There are no limits to the ways you can engage with this intriguing and often comical aspect of history. So, go forth and explore the rich tapestry of medieval military history. The world of oversized swords, unpredictable cannons, and hilariously ineffective siege weapons awaits. Remember to have fun with it, and don't be afraid to chuckle at the absurdity of it all. After all, history isn't always serious. Sometimes it's downright hilarious, and the sheer absurdity of some medieval military technology deserves a good laugh. This will bring us to the next chapter, where, well, that's a story for another time.